The wagon didn't slow down. Most of its windows were dark. That was the part Eliza Wren would never forget, not the crack of her skull against the hardpan, not the burning spread of pain through her left side, not even the sound of the horses screaming as the raiders came howling out of the canyon walls. What she would never forget was the moment she looked up from the ground, bleeding and stunned, and watched Harlan Pruitt lean over the wagon seat, look directly at her, lying in the dust, and snap the reins. He looked right at her, and then he drove away. She called his name. She called it twice. The second time came out as something closer to a scream, ragged and desperate, the kind of sound a person makes when they finally understand that no one is coming. The wagon kept moving. She lay there in the New Mexico badlands, with the sun already hammering down on the back of her neck, her vision swimming, her right palm torn open from catching herself on the rocks. She was 21 years old. She had no water, no food, no horse, no weapon worth mentioning. And the nearest town was somewhere north. How far north, she couldn't say. If you were in her place alone, injured, abandoned in the badlands, with nothing but a brass compass and the clothes on your back, what would you do? Would you give up? Or would you find out what you were actually made of? Eliza Wren found out, and what she discovered out there in that desert, buried behind a stone wall, untouched for 90 years, would change not just her life, but the lives of a people she had never met. Before we go further, if you're watching this story for the first time, take a moment and subscribe to this channel. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city and country you're watching from. We want to know how far this story has traveled, because these are the kinds of stories that deserve to be heard about people who were left behind and chose to rise anyway. Don't miss what's coming next. Now let's go back to the beginning. Eliza had been working for the Pruitt family for 14 months. She had cooked their meals, salted their meat, mended their gear, and driven their second wagon through 3 states. She had done it without complaint, without praise, and without illusion about what she was to them. She wasn't a member of the family. She wasn't even close to it. She was a pair of strong hands attached to a body that Vera Pruitt, Harlan's wife, referred to as sturdy when she was being generous and a trial to look at when she wasn't watching her own mouth. Eliza had heard that once, only once. She hadn't said anything back. She'd just gone to sleep that night, staring at the underside of the wagon canvas, deciding whether the words deserved her anger or her pity. She settled on neither. She settled on indifference, or at least something that could pass for it if she didn't press too hard. She stayed because she needed the work. Her father had died the previous winter, his heart giving out between survey stakes somewhere in Colorado, a quiet death for a man who deserved a louder farewell, and she had no family left to return to. The Pruitts were heading to Santa Fe. Santa Fe meant people, possible employment, something that resembled a future. So she drove their second wagon and ate their leftover biscuits and tried not to think too hard about the kind of woman Vera Pruitt was. The morning of the raid started like every other morning. Eliza was up before the sun, getting the cook fire going, heating water for oats. The Pruitt boys, 2 of them, 16 and 13, neither of whom had ever thanked her for a meal, were still asleep. Harlan was checking the wheels on his wagon. Vera was inside the larger wagon, doing whatever Vera did in the mornings that took so long and produced so little. They were moving through a narrow canyon passage south of the Jornado Range, a route Harlan had chosen because he said it cut 2 days off the trip. The walls were close enough that 2 wagons side by side would have been a tight squeeze. It was the kind of place a man with a map would have chosen. It was also the kind of place a man without a gun would have avoided. The riders came from both ends at once. Eliza heard them before she saw them, hooves on shale, moving fast, too fast for travelers. She was on the driver's bench of the second wagon, and she had enough time to stand up, grab the sideboard, and say zika. Mr. Pruitt, before the first shot cracked off the canyon wall. It wasn't aimed at anyone. It was a warning. 4 men on horseback, bandanas across their faces, rifles up. One of them was shouting something in the kind of voice that didn't leave room for misunderstanding. Harlan Pruitt pulled up his lead wagon. His boys scrambled out from under the canvas, looking wild-eyed and half-dressed. Vera's head appeared in the opening behind the seat. "What do we do?" Vera said. She wasn't asking, she was accusing. "Stay quiet," Harlan said. The riders moved in. They weren't amateurs, they separated naturally, 2 to each wagon, covering angles, keeping distance. One of them came alongside Eliza's wagon, and looked at her with flat, uninterested eyes above his bandana. "Step down," he said. She stepped down. She wasn't stupid. She'd read enough frontier newspapers to know what happened to people who made heroes of themselves when outnumbered and outgunned by strangers with nothing to lose. She stepped down and stood in the dust with her hands visible. They took the Pruitt supply wagon. They cut one of the horses from the team. They rifled through saddlebags and threw half the contents into the dust. They were fast and deliberate, talking to each other in low fragments she could barely make out. And then one of them hit her. She hadn't moved. She hadn't spoken. She'd been standing exactly where she was told. But the man nearest her, the flat-eyed one, apparently didn't like the way she was breathing, or maybe he was just having the kind of day where something needed to suffer for it. He swung the back of his hand across the side of her face hard enough to drop her. She went down on one knee. Her head rang. She tasted blood from where her teeth cut the inside of her cheek. "Stay down," he said. She stayed down. Then they were gone. Just like that, hooves on shale, echoing in both directions, and then fading. The whole thing had lasted maybe 6 minutes. Eliza pushed herself upright. Her head was throbbing. The left side of her face felt like it had been pressed against a hot stove. She spat blood into the dust and looked around. The Pruitt wagon was already moving. Not fast. Harlan hadn't panicked the horses. He was driving at a controlled pace, like a man who had already made his decision and didn't want to revisit it. The two boys were visible in the back. Vera's face appeared over the seat, looked in Eliza's direction, and disappeared again. "Mr. Pruitt." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. The wagon kept moving. "Harlan." She took 3 steps after it. Her left ankle caught something wrong, and she nearly went down again, a rock she hadn't seen, her body not quite working yet. "Harlan, I'm on foot." He didn't look back. She stood in the middle of that canyon and watched the wagon until it went around a bend in the rock and disappeared. She stood there for a while after that too, 10 seconds, 20, because her brain needed a moment to catch up to what had just happened. He knew she was there. He'd heard her. He looked right at her, at the moment when she was still lying in the dust and the raiders were still retreating. She'd seen his face make the calculation. She'd seen him decide. She wasn't worth the trouble. That was the thought she carried out of that canyon, that someone had looked at her and decided she wasn't worth turning the wagon around for. Not because she was wicked. Not because she'd done anything wrong. Just because she was inconvenient and she was heavy. And her body took up more space than Vera Pruitt thought it deserved to. It was the clearest thing anyone had ever said to her without saying a word. She let herself be furious for exactly as long as it took to realize that fury wasn't going to get her out of the canyon. Then she started thinking. Her father's voice was good for that, for the moments when thinking was the only tool she had left. Theodore Wren had been a railroad surveyor for 20 years, and he'd raised Eliza alone after her mother died, which meant he'd raised her the way a surveyor raises a child, practically precisely, without sentiments but not without love. He'd taught her to read the angle of the sun. He'd taught her how water runs downhill even when you can't see it. He'd pressed the brass compass into her palm when she was 9 years old and said, "This will always tell you where north is. The rest is just figuring out how to get there." She still had the compass. It was in the breast pocket of her coat, the one thing she wore in all weather because her father had given it to her, and she could feel it now when she pressed her hand against her chest. She had the compass. She had a small knife on her belt. She had 2 biscuits left from breakfast, wrapped in cloth in her coat pocket. She had the clothes she was wearing, and she had a working knowledge of the New Mexico badlands that was better than most people's, because she'd spent the last 3 months reading every map Harlan Pruitt had refused to look at closely enough. She was east of the San Andres Range. North would take her toward the settlements. But north in the open desert in late morning, with a bloody face and no water, was a way to die slowly. She needed shelter first, then water. The canyon walls to the west were reddish sandstone, which meant shade earlier in the day. She walked west. She walked for a long time. Her left ankle ached from whatever she'd caught on the ground earlier, but it held her weight, which was the only test that mattered. The sun climbed. The heat pressed down on the top of her head like a hand pushing her toward the earth. She stopped twice, once to rest, once to look at her surroundings and recalibrate, and each time she got up again because stopping felt too close to giving up. Her father had a saying about that. The desert doesn't hate you. It just doesn't care either way. Whether you live or die is your problem, not the desert's. She had always thought that was a bleak way to talk to a child. Now she understood it was a mercy. He'd taken pity out of the equation entirely, so she'd never count on it. The sandstone bluff appeared around mid-afternoon, and she nearly missed it, because her vision had started doing something unpleasant at the edges, a shimmer that wasn't heat, the kind that meant her body was starting to give out its warnings. She looked up, and there was the bluff, a curved face of reddish rock with a deep overhang along the bottom, cutting a band of shade across the ground. She aimed for it. Nothing else in the world mattered for the next 45 minutes. She made it. She folded herself into the shade against the rock face and sat there with her back against the stone and her eyes closed, breathing. The temperature difference was immediate, not cool exactly, but 10 degrees off the hammer of direct sun, which felt in that moment like stepping into cold water. She sat there until her heartbeat slowed enough for thought. She ate one biscuit. She allowed herself one slow, deliberate chew at a time, the way her father had taught her to eat. When food was scarce, take your time with it. Let your body believe there's more coming. There wasn't more coming. She spent the last of the afternoon light, exploring the bluff, moving slowly, pressing her hands against the rock face, looking for seepage, for green. Water follows stone. Her father had said that. She was testing the theory against the actual stone, and for a long time the stone said nothing back. Then her boot found something soft. Not mud exactly. More like the suggestion of mud, a slight give in the dust, near the back corner of the bluff, where the rock curved inward. She crouched down. She pressed her palm flat against it. She worked a small hollow with her fingers until something dark and wet appeared at the bottom. It was barely a seep, a spoonful at a time. She dug a small basin with her hands and waited. She waited 2 hours. The hollow filled, slowly, with water the color of weak tea. She had no way to clean it. She drank it anyway, slowly, using cupped hands. It tasted like iron and earth, and she had never been more grateful for anything in her life. That night she slept against the rock, with her coat pulled tight, her father's compass in her closed fist, and the sky wheeling with cold stars above the canyon rim. She made herself a simple promise in the dark. She was not going to die out here because Harlan Pruitt decided she wasn't worth turning around for. That was day one. By the second day, she had established a rhythm. She slept in the heat of midday. She moved in the early morning and the evening. She expanded her water supply by building up the edges of the hollow and waiting longer between drinks. She ate the second biscuit in small pieces, spreading it across the morning. She found a scorpion under a flat rock. She killed it with a stone. She cooked it on a flat piece of shale using dead brush she found at the base of the bluff. It tasted like nothing she had ever eaten before, and she ate every part of it. On the third day, she began working her way deeper into the curved section at the back of the bluff. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Something to do, maybe. Something that felt like progress. She began clearing the fallen debris from the base of the back wall, not because she had reason to, but because her father had also taught her that idle hands in difficult situations led to catastrophic thinking, and catastrophic thinking was the last thing she needed right now. She worked in the shade during the worst heat, moving rock and dried brush and the fine accumulated silt of years. She found the bones of a small animal. She found a shard of old pottery. She found nothing useful. Then, on the afternoon of the third day, she pressed her palm against the back wall and felt something wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just wrong. A section of the stone wall near the base, maybe 2 feet wide and 1.5 feet tall, didn't feel like the rest of the wall. The other sections of rock were cold and solid, and old in the way that ancient things are, fused and immovable. This section had a different quality, less cold, a hairline crack along its top edge that didn't match the natural fractures around it. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. She worked a fingernail into the crack. It went deeper than it should have. She worked the tip of her knife blade in. The crack widened. She felt something give not the stone exactly, but whatever was behind the stone, like pressure releasing. She pressed both palms flat against the section of wall and pushed. The stone shifted inward. Behind it was a hollow in the rock, maybe 18 inches deep, maybe 1.5 feet wide, dark, dry. The inside of it smelled like something very old and very still. and sitting inside, wrapped in black oilskin cloth, tied with a cord that had long since turned to leather, was a package. Eliza sat in the dim afternoon light at the back of that sandstone shelter for a long time without moving. Then she reached in and took it out. The oilskin held. It had been put together by someone who knew what they were doing, layered, tied, sealed at the edges with something that had hardened over time, keeping everything inside dry and intact. She unwrapped it slowly, her hands not entirely steady. There were coins, dozens of them, then more dozens, gold coins worn smooth at the edges from handling, stacked, and bundled together in sections of old cloth. More money than she had ever held in her life. More money than she'd earned in 3 years of working for other families. And beneath the coins, flattened and folded and fragile at the creases, was a letter. The handwriting was cramped and careful, the penmanship of a man who had not done much writing but had wanted to be understood. Eliza pressed close to the light, coming in from the shelter opening, and began to read. "My name is Silas Crow. I do not know who finds this. I ask only that you read what follows before you take the money, because the money is not mine to give without explanation. It belongs to a debt I cannot pay myself, and a wrong I have carried for 30 years. She read it once. She read it twice. Then she sat back against the stone and stared at the coins in her lap, and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with the heat or the hunger or the 3 days of surviving alone in the desert. She had come into this bluff with nothing. She was leaving with something she hadn't been looking for: a dead man's conscience, a 90-year-old secret, and more gold than she knew what to do with. The question wasn't whether to take it. The question was what kind of woman she was going to be when she did. She read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to put it down. The first time, she was just reading words. Her brain was still half dried out from 3 days in the desert, still calibrating what was real and what was the kind of thing a dehydrated mind invents to comfort itself. The second time, she read it slowly, the way her father had taught her to read survey documents, tracking every detail, cross-referencing, not letting one sentence move past her before she understood what it was leaning against. The third time, she read it quietly, almost under her breath, as if saying the words out loud would anchor them to something solid. The man's handwriting was cramped at the start and loosened as he went, the penmanship of someone who had begun carefully, and then, as the confession deepened, had stopped worrying about how it looked and started worrying about whether it was complete. "My name is Silas Crow. I do not know who finds this. I ask only that you read what follows before you take the money, because the money is not mine to give without explanation." He had been part of a gang. He didn't use that word exactly. He called them riders, which told Eliza something about the kind of man he'd been, even at the end of his life, unable to say plainly what he'd spent 20 years running from. But the facts were clear enough once she worked through his careful, circling way of putting them. Then, in the spring of 1883, a group of 6 men had robbed a railroad payroll transfer at a place called Black Creek Crossing, 40 miles east of where Eliza was sitting right now. The payroll was substantial federal funds meant for a new rail survey, guarded by a small private security detail. The heist itself had gone the way robberies go when someone plans them properly: fast, specific, mostly bloodless. Mostly. There had been a young guard. 19 years old, Silas wrote, and he put the age in twice, like he needed to say it more than once for it to mean something. His name was Nathan Vance. When the shooting started, and there was always shooting, even when nobody wanted it, even when the plan said there wouldn't be, Nathan Vance had done the sensible thing. He had dropped his rifle. He'd put his hands up. He was surrendering, visibly, unmistakably, in the middle of an open field with 6 guns pointed at him and nowhere to go. The gang's leader, a man named Judson Vale, had shot him anyway. Silas wrote it plainly, no decoration. Vale shot the boy when he was already down on his knees with his hands showing. I saw it. 2 of the others saw it. Nobody said a word because nobody wanted to be next. After that, the gang split up. They'd agreed beforehand to scatter if anything went wrong, and shooting an unarmed surrendering man was, by anyone's measure, something going wrong. Silas took his share of the gold and rode into the desert and didn't stop riding until the horse gave out. He found the sandstone bluff by accident, a desperate man looking for shade and water, and discovered the seep at the back wall before he died of thirst. He stayed 3 days, And in those 3 days, sitting with a dead boy's blood on his conscience and more gold than he'd earned in his whole life, Silas Crow made a decision that surprised even him. He couldn't give the gold back. There was no safe way to do that. The law would hang him, and Judson Vale, if he found out Silas was still breathing, would do worse before the law got the chance. But he couldn't spend it either. He'd tried to imagine what that life looked like, buying land, buying whiskey, buying himself comfortable, and every time he reached for the picture, Nathan Vance's hands came into it. 19 years old, hands up, kneeling in the grass. So he hid the gold. He walled it in. He wrote down what he'd seen, what he knew, who had done it and why, and he sealed the letter in with the money and put the stone back in place. And then at the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that had gotten shakier and more compressed, as if his hand was running out of time even as he wrote, the gold was stolen. I know that. It cannot be given back to who it was taken from. That time is gone. Nathan Vance left people behind. A sister or so, he said. A mother. If you are a decent person and you find this, give some part of it to them. Not because it makes anything right. Nothing makes it right. But because a boy died with his hands up, and somebody should remember that it mattered. I am not a good man. I am trying to be a slightly less bad one before I run out of chances. Silas Crow Eliza set the letter down on her knee. Outside, the desert had gone the deep amber color of late afternoon. The seep at the back of the hollow made its tiny, patient sound in the quiet. Most of its windows were dark. She sat with her hand resting on top of the folded letter and tried to figure out what she was feeling, and for a long moment she couldn't name it. Not joy, not greed, not fear exactly, though there was a thread of it running under everything, because she was a young woman alone in the desert, with a fortune in stolen gold and a dead man's confession, and those were not easy things to carry. What she felt underneath all of it was something closer to recognition. She knew what it was to be left behind. She knew what it was to be written off as the kind of thing other people didn't need to worry about. Silas Crow, whatever else he'd been, had spent the last years of his life worrying about a boy. Nobody else was worrying about anymore. That was a small, crooked kind of courage. It was also the only kind she'd ever seen up close. She counted the coins. It took her a while. Her hands were still shaking a little, though she chose to blame that on hunger rather than emotion. There were more than 300 gold pieces in total, in varying denominations, some of them older than others, all of them real. She had no way to calculate exactly what they were worth, but she knew enough from her father's talk of railroad financing to know it was a significant sum, more than a year's wages, possibly more than 5 years, depending on the denomination. She could not carry all of it. That was the first practical reality she had to face. She was walking north on a bad ankle with nothing to put the coins in except for her coat pockets, which would tear under the weight within a mile. She needed to move light if she was going to move at all. She took 10 coins. She chose the largest denominations she could identify by feel and weight, turned each one in her fingers, put the 10 into her breast pocket alongside her father's compass. Then she wrapped the rest back in the oilskin carefully, firmly, resealing the edges as best she could with her thumbnail, and placed the package back in the hollow. She put the stone back. She pressed it into place with both palms and felt it seat with a solidity that reassured her. No one had found this in 30 years. It would hold a little longer. She stood up, put Silas Crow's letter inside her coat next to the coins, and looked at the hollow in the rock for a moment. Then she picked up her father's compass, got her bearings, and walked north. She almost didn't make it. That was something she didn't talk about much. Afterward, how close the margin actually was between surviving and not. She had a way of describing the walk to Dustwater Springs that made it sound manageable, even purposeful. The truth was that by the second day of walking, she had run through the last of her water. Her ankle had swollen badly enough that she was limping with a rolling gait that burned her hip and lower back. And somewhere around mid-afternoon of that second day, she sat down against a creosote bush and genuinely didn't know if she was going to get up. She sat there for a long time. She thought about her father. She thought about Harlan Pruitt's face on the wagon seat, doing that calculation. She thought about Silas Crow's, who had died in a desert not unlike this one, with a confession written and sealed, and nothing left to do but wait and see if the world would be decent enough to eventually make use of it. She got up. She was moving again by the time the sun got low, slower than before, favoring the ankle worse, but moving. She followed her compass north, by northwest, the way her father had marked as water probable on the survey maps she'd memorized from Pruitt's saddlebag. She kept her eyes on the ground ahead of her and tried not to think about anything that wasn't the next 20 feet. The prospector found her at sundown of the third day of walking. He came up on a mule going south, which was lucky. If he'd been going north, he might have gotten ahead of her too fast to notice. She heard the mule before she saw it and stopped walking and stood still because she'd lost conserved blood sugar, that her body was conserving everything, including the energy it took to figure out if something was a threat. The man on the mule pulled up about 30 feet away and looked at her the way people look at things that don't quite make sense. "You alone?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Out here? On foot?" That's right. He was a weathered man of maybe 55, with a gray beard that needed attention and eyes that had spent too many years squinting into the desert sun. He looked at her face, still bruised along the lemta side from the raider's hand, and at her posture, and at her feet, and then he climbed down off the mule without making a production of it. "Calder Rusk," he said. "I don't have much water left, but I've got some." Eliza Wren. She let herself take one step toward him and then stopped, because her pride was the last thing still functioning correctly, and she wasn't going to lunge for a water canteen in front of a stranger. "I'd be grateful for whatever you can spare." He handed her the canteen. She drank from it, slowly, the way her father taught slow when you're depleted, not fast, no matter what your body says. And when she handed it back, Calder Rusk was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You know how to drink like someone who knows what they're doing," he said. "My father was a surveyor." "Ah." He seemed to find that sufficient. "There's a settlement north about a day's ride. Dustwater Springs. Not much to recommend it, but they've got a boarding house and a doctor who mostly knows what he's doing." He looked at her ankle. "That needs looking at." "I know. You got money for a room?" She thought about the 10 coins in her breast pocket, pressed against her father's compass, and Silas Crow's letter. "Some," she said. He nodded and said nothing about the bruised face or the missing horse or the fact that she'd been walking alone in the New Mexico desert for 3 days, with a bad ankle and a story she obviously wasn't ready to tell. That restraint, she thought, was its own kind of decency. She appreciated it more than she would have appreciated questions. He let her ride the mule. He walked alongside. They reached Dustwater Springs the following afternoon. The town was exactly what Calder Rusk had described, and not much more a main street of maybe 15 buildings, half of them commercial and half of them residential, arranged without particular planning along a road that had started as a cattle trail and never entirely evolved past that origin. There was a general store, a blacksmith, small post office, a saloon that looked like it had weathered a few decades of hard use, and a boarding house run by a woman whose name Eliza didn't yet know. She knew it within an hour. Clara Finch ran the boarding house the way certain women run things, with efficiency and a warmth that somehow didn't undercut the efficiency. She was somewhere in her late 50s, broad-shouldered, with thick gray hair pinned back and the kind of face that had smiled enough times to leave permanent marks in the right places. She took one look at Eliza standing in her doorway, bruised, limping, travel-dirty, a stranger, and said, "You look like you've had a week of it. Come in. I have a little money for a room," Eliza said. "We'll sort that out after you've had water and something to eat. Come in." The doctor, a compact man named Beale, who did indeed mostly know what he was doing, wrapped her ankle and declared it a bad sprain rather than a break, which Eliza accepted with more relief than she let on. He cleaned the bruising on her face, asked no questions she didn't volunteer answers to, and charged her a fee that was lower than she expected. She paid him from the coins in her pocket, keeping the exchange casual, not letting him see the full weight of what she was carrying. He took the coin, turned it over once, and looked at her with a mildly elevated eyebrow, but didn't say anything beyond. "Come back if the swelling doesn't go down." She didn't sleep well that first night. The bed was soft in comparison to the desert floor, which should have helped, and somehow made it worse. Her body didn't quite trust the softness, kept waiting for the cold ground to come back. She lay on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about the hollow in the rock and the oilskin package, and Nathan Vance, 19 years old, hands up, kneeling in a field somewhere east of the San Andres Mountains 90 years ago. Silas Crow had been a thief, and probably other worse things. But he'd written that letter and sealed those coins in the dark and waited, in his way, for someone to carry the message forward. You could make a case that a man who does that after a lifetime of worse choices isn't the simplest kind of person to judge. Eliza had spent a lot of time being judged herself. She knew how the simple kind went. In the morning, she ate breakfast in Clara Finch's kitchen, salt pork and eggs and biscuits that were better than anything she'd eaten in 14 months with the Pruitts, and then she asked Clara how she might go about finding the county sheriff. Clara set down the coffee pot and looked at her. What kind of finding are we talking about? The kind where I go to his office and knock on the door, Eliza said. I have some information about an old crime. I want to know if it's worth anything to anybody. Clara studied her for a moment. Wade Mercer's the sheriff. He's got an office on the south end of Main Street, next to the post office. He's usually in by 8. Is he a fair man? Clara seemed to weigh this honestly. He's a careful man. Whether careful is the same as fair depends on what you bring him. She paused. He's not going to be interested in trouble that doesn't involve his county. This involves his county, Eliza said, or close enough to it. The sheriff's office was a single building that smelled like old coffee and leather and the kind of work that doesn't have convenient hours. Most of its windows dark. Wade Mercer was behind his desk when Eliza knocked and pushed the door open. A man in his mid-40s with a sheriff's star on his chest and the face of someone who had heard most things and reserved judgment on the rest of them. He wasn't large. He had the compact, contained quality of a person who had learned to project more authority than his physical size strictly warranted. Help you, he said. I hope so. She came in and closed the door behind her. She'd decided on the walk over that she was going to be direct, because she was bad at being anything else, and because she'd learned at anything else, and because she'd learned that directness, while it occasionally alarmed people, was less expensive than the alternative in the long run. My name is Eliza Wren. I've been in town less than a day. I found something in the badlands south of the San Andres Range that I think your county records need to know about. He looked at her. Then he gestured at the chair across from his desk. Sit down, Miss Wren. She sat. She put a copy of Silas Crow's letter on the desk between them. She'd spent 2 hours the night before, sitting at the small desk in her room at Clara's boarding house, copying the letter Soswalt word for word on paper she'd borrowed from Clara. She still had the original tucked inside her coat, the original she was keeping. Mercer picked up the copy and read it. He read it all the way through without expression, which she appreciated. Some men would have started talking before they finished reading, offering opinions on what they were about to read before they'd read it. Mercer was not that kind of man. When he finished, he set it down. This Silas Crow, he said. You know anything about him beyond what's written here? Nothing. The letter was all there was. Where did you find it? She'd anticipated this in a rock shelter in the badlands south of the Jornado Range. I was stranded after a wagon raid and I took shelter in a sandstone bluff. That was true. The letter was wedged in a crevice in the back wall. That was approximately true. Mercer looked at her for a moment. She met his eyes without difficulty. She wasn't lying. She was just not leading with everything. The Black Creek robbery, he said. 1883. I know the name. Before my time here, but it's in the county historical records. It was a federal matter, so the county had documentation from the inquiry afterward. He tapped the letter with one finger. Judson Vale's name is in those records. He was the suspected ringleader. Suspected, she said. Suspected. He died before the investigation concluded. Some dispute about who actually shot the guard. The inquiry eventually settled on Silas Crow as the most likely suspect. But Crow had disappeared, and the witnesses were unreliable. He paused. If Crow's account here is accurate, the inquiry got it wrong. That's what I think, yes. He leaned back in his chair. Miss Wren, I want to be straight with you. Silas Crow is almost certainly dead. Judson Vale is definitely dead. The payroll guard Nathan Vance has been dead for 90 years. There's nothing the law can do with this information, in terms of prosecution. Everyone who did anything is gone. I know, she said. So what is it you're expecting from me? She looked at him directly. I want the official record corrected. Silas Crow's name is attached to a murder he may not have committed. Nathan Vance was shot with his hands up, and the man who shot him died with a good reputation, while Crow died with a bad one. I don't think that's right. Mercer studied her. She had the sense he was recalibrating something. You walked into a sheriff's office the day after you were raided and left stranded in the desert, he said, to ask me to correct the reputation of a dead outlaw you never met. Yes. Any particular reason? She thought about Silas Crow's last line. I am not a good man. I am trying to be a slightly less bad one before I run out of chances. She thought about a 19-year-old boy with his hands in the air. He asked someone to, she said. I was the someone who found the letter. Mercer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'll pull the county records. I'll look at what the original inquiry documented. If the evidence supports what this letter claims, I'll file an amendment to the historical record. That's the most I can do, but I'll do that much. That's what I'm asking for, she said. She stood. She picked up her hat from her knee. She was almost to the door when he said, Miss Wren. She stopped. Where are you planning to stay in Dustwater Springs? It was a practical question. She chose to answer it practically. I'm not sure yet. I'll be at Clara Finch's house for a few days while my ankle heals. And after? She thought about the coins in her pocket. She thought about the hollow in the rock and the oilskin package and the particular weight of carrying a dead man's responsibility across 30 miles of desert. After, she said, I'm going to figure out what comes next. What came next arrived sooner than she expected, in the form of a conversation she didn't intend to have. She was at the general store the following afternoon, moving on her wrapped ankle with a care that Clara had already warned her twice was insufficient, when she overheard two men near the back of the store talking about a property at the east edge of town. Most of its windows were dark, not loudly the way people talk when they're not trying to be overheard, but aren't particularly worried about it either. She caught fragments abandoned since old Hanley left. The deed's been sitting at the county clerk's, 5 acres, stone structure. Nobody's going to take it on. She bought her supplies and then walked over, not entirely on purpose, and said to the nearer of the two men, Excuse me. I couldn't help overhearing. What property were you talking about? The man, young, maybe 30, with a carpenter's hands and a direct way of looking at people, glanced at her ankle and then at her face and said, Old Hanley Homestead, east side of town, past the mill track. Why? How much is the county asking for it? He looked at her a moment. You're not from here. No, she said, but I might be staying. His name was Jonah Bell. He was the town's primary carpenter, which explained the hands, and he had a habit of answering questions fully and without embellishment, which she respected immediately. He told her what the county was asking, a figure she could cover with 3 of the coins still in her pocket, and described the property honestly. A ruined stone cabin with a collapsed roof, 5 acres of rough but workable land, a dry well that might be persuadable with labor. No outbuildings worth mentioning. You'd need significant work to make it livable, he said. How significant? A new roof, for certain. The stone walls are solid, which is something. But everything above the top of the walls is gone. Weather took the rafters about 2 winters back. He paused. Most people look at it and keep walking. Most people, she said, aren't coming from where I'm coming from. That evening, she sat at the small desk in her room at Clara's boarding house, with the coins counted out in front of her and Silas Crow's letter at her elbow, and she did the arithmetic. The 10 coins she'd carried out of the desert would cover the property, and have something left over for initial supplies. The rest of the gold, more than she could count in her head, was still in the hollow in the rock, waiting. She could go back and get it. She knew the route well enough. She could load a mule and bring it out in stages. She could be wealthy by the standards of Dustwater Springs within a few weeks. Or she could be careful. She'd spent her whole life around people who had grabbed everything they could as fast as they could, and she'd seen where that left them. Harlan Pruitt with his shortcuts, Judson Vale with his gun. Even Silas Crow, who'd taken his share of the gold and fled with it and spent 30 years trying to figure out how to live with what he'd done. The gold needed to be brought out slowly and purposefully. A young woman arriving in a small town and suddenly producing a fortune from nowhere was not a story that ended quietly. People asked questions. Questions led to other questions. And somewhere in those questions was a conversation she was not ready to have about a cave in the Badlands, and an oilskin package, and a dead man's conscience. She needed that time to establish herself first. She needed to be a person in this town before she was a wealthy person. She needed a reason to be here that had nothing to do with what she'd found. She needed land. She went to the county clerk's office the next morning and put 3 gold coins on Edwin Pike's desk. Pike was a spare, meticulous man of about 60, with the habits of someone who had been keeping records for a very long time and took the responsibility seriously. He looked at the coins, then at her, then at the deed she was asking about. "You understand the condition of the property," he said. "I do. Most people who've looked at it have decided the work isn't worth the price. With respect, Mr. Pike," she said, "the work is exactly why I want it. I need something to do." He processed the paperwork with the quiet efficiency of a man who appreciated directness. When he slid the deed across the desk, Eliza picked it up and held it for a moment before folding it and putting it inside her coat next to the compass and the letter. She owned land. She had never owned anything in her life. Not a piece of furniture, not an acre, not even the battered old trunk she'd carried from town to town as a hired hand, which technically belonged to the family that had given it to her and expected it back. Most of its windows were dark. She stood on the outside the clerk's office with the deed folded inside her coat and tried to figure out what the feeling was, and then she realized it was just solid, like finding her footing after a long time of being off balance. Nothing glamorous, nothing that felt like a storybook, just solid ground underfoot and something in her chest that had unclenched a fraction. She walked east past the mill track. The Hanley homestead was worse than Jonah Bell's honest description had prepared her for. The stone walls stood, which was indeed something old fieldstone, laid by someone who knew what they were doing and had done it with care. But the roof was completely gone, just as he'd said, and what was left of the interior was open to the sky and full of years of blown-in debris and the remains of 2 winters' worth of snow and rain damage. The floor dirt, mostly, with some remnants of old plank flooring at the edges, was uneven and damp in places. The dry well at the side was exactly as dry as advertised. She stood in what had once been the main room and looked up at the sky through the absent roof and felt the sun on her face. Then she pushed up her sleeves and began clearing the debris. She worked until the light failed. She came back the next morning and worked again. Her ankle ached through the wrapping, but it held barely, and with the kind of complaint that told her she was going to pay for this later, but it held. She worked methodically, the way her father had always worked, clearing from the outside in, stacking what was salvageable against the standing wall, removing what wasn't. On the 3rd afternoon, Jonah Bell appeared at the edge of what had been the doorway and watched her for a while without speaking. "Thought you'd have slowed down by now," he finally said. "Why?" she said without stopping. He was quiet for a moment. "Most people do." "I don't have a most people pace," she said. "I have my own pace." He looked at the work she'd done, the cleared floor, the stacked stone, the reorganized debris, and she could see him reassessing something. She'd seen that look before, on men who'd expected her to move slower or accomplish less, and were recalculating the math. "I could help with the roof design," he said. "No charge for the consultation. If you want an extra set of eyes on what you're working with, structurally." She straightened up and looked at him. He wasn't offering charity, she could tell the difference. He was offering a professional courtesy to someone whose work had earned it. "I'd appreciate that," she said. He came back the next morning with a notebook. They spent an hour walking the perimeter of the structure, Jonah tapping the walls with his knuckles in places and listening, Eliza asking questions that surprised him enough that he started answering them in more technical detail than he'd originally intended. She had a surveyor's understanding of load and structure that most people who weren't builders didn't have, and she could read a measurement and extrapolate from it in ways that made him stop twice and look at her. "Your father teach you this too?" he asked. "He taught me to read anything structural," said a person who could understand how things hold together would never be entirely helpless. She paused. He was right as far as that goes. Jonah Bell wrote out a materials list in his notebook and tore the page out and gave it to her. She took it without mentioning that she could have written it herself. Sometimes being capable was less useful than being gracious. It was on the 4th day of work at the homestead that Clara Finch showed up with a covered pot and a look on her face that made clear this wasn't a social call so much as a personal decision she'd made and wasn't interested in debating. "You're working through meals again," Clara said. "I could tell from the timing. Sit down." Sit down, Eliza." She sat down on a fieldstone she'd been using as a work surface and accepted the pot, which turned out to contain beans and salt pork, and something that smelled considerably better than anything she'd prepared for herself in the past week. Clara sat on a stone across from her and watched her eat for a moment. Jonah Bell tells me you're planning to restore this place yourself. With some help, Eliza said. He says you know what you're doing. I know enough to ask for what I don't know. She ate another spoonful. That's different from knowing everything, but it's functional. Clara looked around at the work she'd done. Where are you from, Eliza? Before all this. It was a fair question. The kind people in small towns ask because they were genuinely curious, rather than because they intended to use the answer. Everywhere, more or less. My father moved with his work. I moved with him until he died. Then I moved with other people's work, until that stopped working out. Clara looked at the bruise, which had faded to yellow and green at the edges. She didn't ask. You're welcome at my table, she said, for as long as you're here. For meals, I mean. Not charity, I don't do charity. It makes everyone uncomfortable. But you can do a few hours' work around the boarding house in trade, if that suits you better. Eliza looked at her. It suits me considerably better. Good. Clara stood, retrieved the empty pot, and dusted off her skirt. Jonah's a good man, she said, not quite as an aside. Steady. Not the kind who talks too much. Eliza kept her expression neutral. He does seem competent. Clara smiled at something and walked back toward the road. That night, alone in her room, Eliza spread the deed on the desk and set her father's compass on top of it and looked at both of them for a long time. Then she unfolded Silas Crow's letter and read the bottom of it once more, slowly. I am not a good man. I am trying to be a slightly less bad one before I run out of chances. She thought about Nathan Vance's descendants in Nebraska. A sister Silas had written, or someone like a sister. A family that had been waiting, without knowing it, for a debt to be acknowledged. She hadn't forgotten. She'd been carrying it since the desert. But she couldn't do that part yet. Not until she had more access to the gold, and not until she'd established herself well enough here that an unexplained act of generosity wouldn't draw the kind of attention she couldn't yet afford. She put the letter away. She put the compass away. She lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She had land. She had a plan, or the beginning of one. She had a carpenter's professional opinion and a boarding house keeper who'd decided to feed her, and a sheriff who was pulling county records in the next room over from whatever it was sheriffs did in the evenings. And somewhere in the Badlands, south of the Jornado Range, behind a flat stone in a sandstone shelter, a dead man's conscience was waiting to see what she'd do with the rest of it. She closed her eyes. Her ankle hurt. Her hands were torn up from the clearing work. Somewhere in the night, a dog in town was barking at something that apparently required sustained commentary. She slept better than she had since the desert. Sheriff Mercer came back to her on a Tuesday. She was at the homestead when he found her, up on a section of the standing wall where she'd been mortaring a gap in the upper course of stone that had been letting in wind from the west. She heard boots on the cleared ground below, and looked down and saw him standing with his hat in his hands, squinting up at her with the expression of a man who had expected to find her somewhere more conventional. Miss Wren, he said. Sheriff. She set down her trowel and climbed down carefully, favoring the ankle out of habit more than necessity. Now it had mostly healed, though it still told her about the weather. She wiped her hands on the rag tucked into her belt. What did you find? He looked at the work she'd done, on the homestead, a week's worth of clearing and structural preparation, more progress than most people would have made in a month, and then he looked back at her. Can we sit somewhere? They sat on the fieldstones she'd arranged near the south wall, which caught the afternoon sun and held its warmth. Mercer put his hat on his knee and pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket. Not the copy of Silas Crow's letter, something else. Something official-looking, with the county seal visible at the top. I pulled the Black Creek inquiry records from the archive, he said. Edwin Pike helped me locate them. They're old bound in, with a batch of federal correspondence from the 1880s, which is why they weren't easy to find. But they're complete. What do they say? He unfolded the paper slowly, which told her he was organizing his thoughts rather than organizing the document. The original inquiry confirmed Judson Vale led the gang. That part, nobody disputed Vale had a reputation, and the witnesses who survived the robbery were consistent on that point. He paused. The murder of Nathan Vance was attributed to Silas Crow based on two things. First, two of the other gang members caught later separately identified Crow as the shooter. Second, Crow fled, which the inquiry took as evidence of guilt. But Vale fled too, Eliza said. Vale fled later, and he was caught, and he had a lawyer. Mercer's voice was level, but she could hear something in it, not exactly anger, more like the particular tiredness of someone who has spent time in county archives and come out the other side, with a clear view of how justice actually worked in 1883. His lawyer argued that the witnesses against him were unreliable. Both of them were convicted gang members themselves, looking for reduced sentences. The case against Vale collapsed before it reached trial. Eliza sat with that for a moment. So Vale walked free. Vale walked free. Died in a hotel in Albuquerque 11 years later, prosperous and unbothered. He refolded the paper. Crows disappeared and was never found, so the inquiry concluded with his name attached to the murder as the most probable suspect. Uncontested, because he wasn't there to contest it. And Nathan Vance. Nathan Vance is listed in the inquiry records as killed in the commission of the robbery. No further notation, no mention of circumstances, whether he was surrendering, whether he was armed when he was shot, nothing. He looked at her. If Silas Crow's account is accurate, that notation is substantially incomplete. It's not just incomplete, she said, it's wrong. Yes, he said it without hedging. It's wrong. She appreciated that. Some men would have found a way to soften it into something more comfortable. Well, we can't say for certain, or given the limitations of what we know, and she'd have had to sit there being patient about it. Mercer just said it was wrong, because that's what the evidence indicated. Can you amend the record? She asked. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. He put the paper back in his pocket. I spoke with Edwin Pike. We can file a formal notation in the county historical record, not a reversal. Exactly. Because the original inquiry was a federal matter, and the county doesn't have jurisdiction to overturn a federal finding. But we can attach a supplementary document to the existing record that presents the Crow confession and the supporting evidence and notes that the original finding is disputed. He paused. It won't clear Crow's name officially, but anyone who looks at that record from now on will see both versions of what happened. Eliza thought about that. She thought about Silas Crow sitting in a sandstone shelter in the Badlands, writing by what light he had, choosing his words carefully, because he knew he wouldn't get another chance. He hadn't asked for his name to be cleared. He'd known that was too much to hope for. He'd asked for the truth to exist somewhere, in some form, where it could be found. That's what he wanted, she said. Not a pardon, just a record. Mercer nodded. Pike drafted the notation yesterday. It will be filed by end of week. He looked at her, with something that had shifted slightly from the careful official expression he'd brought into her homestead. Miss Wren, I want to ask you something, and you're free to tell me it's none of my business. Go ahead. That confession, you said it was wedged in a crevice in the rock wall. That's right. And there was nothing else with it? No personal effects, no other materials? She met his eyes steadily. Just the letter, she said, and a carved wooden bird. Small. Left behind by whoever had been there before. This part was true. She'd found a small carving near the hollow, worn smooth by handling. She'd taken it. Mercer studied her face. He was a careful man, as Clara had said, careful about what he said, but also careful about what he observed. She had the sense that he knew, or suspected, that she wasn't telling him everything. Most of its windows were dark. But here was the thing about Wade Mercer. He was also a man who had spent enough time in a frontier town to understand that people who showed up carrying other people's burdens usually had reasons for what they held back, and that interrogating those reasons was often less useful than watching what the person did next. All right, he said. He stood and picked up his hat and put it on. The record will be filed by Friday. I'll send word. He was halfway to the road when she said, Sheriff. He turned. Nathan Vance, did the inquiry record say anything about his family? Whether he had any? Mercer thought about it. There was a mention, I think. A next of kin notification was sent to a family in Nebraska. A sister, if I remember correctly. He paused. Just curious, she said. He was 19. Somebody would have wondered what happened to him. Mercer looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and walked back to town. She turned back to the wall and picked up her trowel, and stood looking at the gap in the stonework for a while before she started mortaring again. Her hands moved on their own, the way they'd learned to over the past weeks, while her mind worked on something separate and quieter. Nebraska. A sister. She needed more of the gold. Not for herself, so for what she was going to do next, which she'd been thinking about since the first night She'd read Silas Crow's letter by lamplight in Clara Finch's boarding house. But getting back to the cave meant getting transportation, which meant she needed a legitimate reason to be heading south into the Badlands, which meant she needed a cover story that was close enough to the truth not to require maintenance. The solution came to her 3 days later, unexpectedly, in the form of a conversation she didn't go looking for. She was at the general store. Again, she was often at the general store, because building a habitable home out of a ruined one required a constant and somewhat humbling supply of hardware when she overheard the store's owner, a barrel-chested man named Garrett Sully, arguing with a younger man over a supply order that had come in short. Sully was annoyed. The younger man was defensive. Neither of them was listening to the other. Eliza waited until there was a pause in the arguments and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Sully. Do you keep a mule for rent, or do you know someone who does?" Sully looked at her, the annoyance on his face shifting to something more commercial. "I've got a mule and a flat cart for rent by the day." "Why?" "I need to go back south," she said, "into the Badlands. I left some personal effects behind when I came through before I was stranded, as some people in town know. I want to recover what I left." This was true, as far as it went, and she said it plainly because plain statements invited less scrutiny than elaborate ones. Most of its windows were dark. Sully looked at her with the mild skepticism of a man who was calculating whether the rental fee was worth the concern. "The Badlands south of the Jornado Range? That's better than a day's travel each way." "I know. I walked it coming north." She let that settle for a moment. "I'd need the mule and cart for 3 days." He quoted her a price that was fair. She paid it without negotiating, which she'd learned was the most efficient way to complete a transaction when you didn't have time to waste, and the price was reasonable. She left 2 days later, at first light with Calder Rusk. This was not her original plan. Her original plan had involved going alone, which she'd known even as she formed it was a weak plan. The Badlands were manageable for someone who knew them, she'd proved that, but managing them alone, while also loading a mule cart with oilskin packages of gold coins without anyone seeing, was a different and considerably more complicated proposition. Calder Rusk solved that problem by showing up at Clara Finch's boarding house the evening before she was set to leave, hat in hand, saying he'd heard she was heading south, and he had business in the same direction. "What business?" she said. "Prospecting." He said it without embarrassment. "I prospect in the Badlands south of the Jornado Range regularly. Have for 15 years. He looked at her with those squinting desert eyes. "I thought, since you were going the same direction, and you know the terrain better than you should for someone who was only stranded there briefly, we might travel together. Company safer." She looked at him. He looked back. He was not a man who pushed. She'd learned that about him on the walk north. He made his offer, and then he waited for the other person to decide. "I'd appreciate the company," she said. On the trail south the next morning, with the sun not yet fully up, and the desert air still carrying that particular cold that the nights leave behind, Calder Rusk rode his mule, and she drove Sully's flat cart, and they talked in the easy, sporadic way of people who are comfortable with silence and don't feel obligated to fill it. He told her about 15 years of prospecting the San Andres Range, and its approach is not rich prospecting. He clarified, but enough to keep him moving and interested, which at his age was what he was looking for. His wife had died 8 years ago. His son was somewhere Colorado, possibly doing well, possibly not. They weren't in regular contact, which he described with the particular matter-of-fact sadness of a man who has decided not to dramatize the things he can't fix. She told him about her father, about the survey work and the maps and the brass compass, and what it meant to be raised by someone who treated practical knowledge as the highest form of love. She didn't tell him everything. She never told people everything, but she told him enough that when he said, "You're not really going back for personal effects, are you?" she didn't immediately deny it. "I'm going back for something important that I left behind," she said. "That part's true. Something you couldn't bring out the first time. Something I wasn't ready to bring out." He was quiet for a while. The mule's hooves on the hardpan made a steady rhythm. "None of my business," he said finally. "Thank you," she said. "But," he glanced at her, "if it's something that gets heavy, you've got a flat cart and 2 sets of hands." She thought about that for a long time as the desert opened up. Around them the sandstone formations in the distance, the creosote and the scrub, the sky going from gray-pink to the particular sharp blue that only the desert did at full morning. I might take you up on that, she said. They found the bluff on the afternoon of the second day. She recognized it from a distance, the curved face of reddish sandstone, the deep overhang, and she felt something move in her chest when she saw it. The place where she'd survived. The place where everything had changed. It looked the same as she'd left it, small and unremarkable in the vastness of the desert, the kind of thing you'd ride past without noticing. Calder made camp at the base of the bluff and didn't follow her into the shelter. She went in alone. The hollow in the back wall was exactly as she'd left it. The stone seat at the edges undisturbed. She worked it loose with her fingers. It took longer than the first time, because her hands were shaking in a way she didn't entirely expect, and pulled the oilskin package out into the light. She sat with it for a while. Then she opened it. The coins were all there. Every one she'd counted. She sat in that shelter with more than 300 gold pieces in her lap and thought about Silas Crow for the last time in that place, and then she repacked the oilskin, wrapped the whole thing in the spare blanket she'd brought, and carried it out to the flat cart. Calder looked at the wrapped bundle. He looked at her face. He said nothing. I'll explain when we're back in Dustwater Springs, she said. Take your time, he said. They made camp that night at the base of the bluff, and in the morning they began the trip north. The cart was heavier with the package on it, not dramatically so but enough that Sully's mule felt the difference and let everyone know about it in the particular way of mules. Eliza drove with one hand on the reins and her other hand resting near the bundle, which she recognized as irrational. Nobody was going to come along and take it, but couldn't quite stop herself from doing. The trip north took a day and a half. When they reached Dustwater Springs, she drove straight to her homestead and unloaded the bundle into the interior of the stone structure. In the corner she'd already reinforced and covered with a board she'd been using as a work surface. Then she sat on her fieldstone and looked at Calder Rusk, who was leaning against the south wall of the homestead with his arms folded and the expression of a man who had been patient long enough. She told him. Not everything. She didn't tell him the amount, and she didn't tell him about the Vance family yet, because some things needed to be decided before they were spoken out loud. But she told him about the hollow in the wall and the oilskin package and the letter, and Silas Crow and Nathan Vance and what she'd done with it so far. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You walked out of the desert with a fortune in gold coins, he said, and the first thing you did was go to the sheriff about a murder that happened 90 years ago. The letter asked me to. The letter asked you to, from a dead man. Yes. He pulled at his beard. And you're planning to send money to the Vance family. Part of it. When I can, without drawing the kind of attention that creates problems. He looked at her for a long time. She'd gotten used to that the way people looked at her in Dustwater Springs when she did something that didn't fit their idea of what she'd do next. She let them look. She'd stopped being bothered by being underestimated somewhere around the second day in the desert. All right, Calder said. All right, you want advice? Keep it distributed. Don't spend it all through the same channels. Gold coins are harder to trace than paper currencies, but a young woman suddenly producing a lot of money in a small town produces its own kind of attention. He paused. There are ways to convert it over time, without it looking like anything in particular. She looked at him. You sound like a man who's thought about this before. He smiled for the first time, which rearranged his face considerably. I've been prospecting for 15 years, he said. Finding things is the easy part. What you do with them afterward is where people generally go wrong. She trusted Calder Rusk the way she'd trusted her father, not completely, because she'd learned that complete trust was a thing you offered to very few people in a lifetime and spent carefully when you did, but substantially and with a clear sense of where the trust was grounded. He was honest about what he knew and what he didn't. He had no particular agenda where she was concerned. And he had the prospector's fundamental understanding that discovery was only the beginning of a longer and more complicated process. Over the next 3 weeks, while she continued work on the homestead, she and Calder converted a portion of the gold carefully, slowly, through 3 different channels he'd used before, without incident. Some went to a bank in the county seat, transferred in amounts that didn't warrant particular scrutiny. Some was exchanged privately through a coin dealer Calder knew in a town 4 miles north, a man who asked no kind of questions and charged a reasonable commission for that quality of restraint. The money of its windows were dark. that came back to her was cleaner, quieter, and considerably more manageable than a wrapped bundle of 90-year-old gold coins hidden under a board in a ruined homestead. She kept most of it in the county bank account, drawing on it in modest amounts for building materials and supplies. She kept a smaller portion in a tin box under the floorboard she'd replaced at the homestead, the one she'd had to repair anyway and had reinforced while she was at it. And she kept $2,000 separate, in a bank draft drawn on the county account, folded inside Silas Crow's letter, waiting for the right moment. Edwin Pike found the right moment for her, entirely without knowing he was doing it. She ran into him at the post office on a Wednesday afternoon, both of them collecting mail, and he mentioned, with the pride of a man for whom record-keeping was a personal calling, that he and Sheriff Mercer had filed the supplementary notation to the Black Creek Inquiry record that week. It was official. The County Historical Archive now contained both versions of what had happened at Black Creek Crossing in 1883. "Did you include the family notification?" she asked. "For the Vance family?" He looked at her. There was a mention in the original inquiry of next of kin notification to a family in Nebraska. "We included that in the supplementary record." "Yes." He paused. The original notification would have been nearly 90 years ago. The family now would be grandchildren, or great-grandchildren, if there are any. "Is there a way to find a current address?" Pike adjusted his spectacles. "Possibly. Through county records in Nebraska if I wrote to the relevant clerk's office. It would take some time." He looked at her with the mild and inquisitive expression of a man who kept records for a living and understood the weight that correspondence could carry. Is there a reason you'd want to find them?" She thought about how to answer that. "I'd like to write them a letter," she said, "about what the notation says, about what actually happened to Nathan Vance." She paused. "I think they deserve to know that someone finally put it in the official record." Pike nodded slowly. "I'll write to the Nebraska clerk's office this week." It took 4 weeks to get a response. The clerk in the Nebraska county where the Vance family had originally settled confirmed that a family by that name was still in the area, a farmer named Denton Vance, great-grandnephew of the original Nathan, working a piece of land that had been in the family since before the Black Creek robbery. Drought years, the clerk mentioned in a postscript that was probably not strictly his business to include. Hard times on the land. Eliza sat with that letter for a long time. Then she took the bank draft for $2,000 of Silas Crow's letter, wrote a new envelope, and spent an evening writing the most careful letter of her life. She did not mention Goldeld. She did not mention the cave or the oilskin or anything about how the money had come to exist. She explained briefly that she had come across information related to the Black Creek inquiry of 1883 and had worked with the county sheriff and clerk to file a supplementary record that Nathan Vance's death was now documented as having occurred under disputed circumstances, and that Silas Crow's account of what had actually happened was now part of the official county archive. Then she wrote, "Enclosed with this letter is a bank draft for $2,000. This is not charity. It represents a debt that was owed to your family for nearly a century, a debt that should have been acknowledged long ago and was not. Please use it however you see fit. No acknowledgement is necessary and none is expected. This is simply an old balance, finally settled." She folded the bank draft inside the letter. She sealed the envelope. She put Silas Crow's original letter back inside her coat, next to the compass. She stood at the post office window the next morning and handed the envelope to the clerk. "Nebraska?" the clerk said. "Nebraska," she said. She walked out of the post office into the main street of Dustwater Springs and stood there for a moment in the morning light. Down the street, she could see Jonah Bell's workshop, the doors open, the sound of hammering coming out at regular intervals. She could see the sheriff's office, where the door was propped open in the late autumn warmth. She could see Clara Finch's boarding house, where she no longer lived, but where she still showed up twice a week for the work-for-meals arrangement that had become, quietly, something closer to friendship. She had sent $2,000 to a family she had never met, on behalf of a dead man she'd also never met, to settle a debt that had been accumulating since before she was born. She waited to see how that felt. It felt mostly correct. Not triumphant, not particularly warm. Just correct the way a calculation feels when you run it twice, and both times it comes out to the same answer. She turned back toward her homestead and started walking. The work was not done. In fact, the work was entering its most demanding phase. Jonah Bell had assessed the structural requirements for the new roof and produced a materials list that was honest about both the cost and the labor, and Stu's been wise. She'd been gathering materials for 2 weeks in between the trips to the bank and the county clerk's office and the post office. The stone walls were solid, as Jonah had confirmed after more careful inspection, solid and true, laid by old Hanley or whoever had built the original cabin with more care than the outcome of their occupancy would suggest. But a stone wall without a roof was not a home. It was a monument to a problem. She had the materials now. What she needed was the labor, and she was beginning to understand that there was a limit to what she could do alone, or even with Jonah's professional guidance and occasional direct assistance. The roof timbers needed to be lifted and set by more than 2 pairs of hands. The physics of it were plain. She'd done the calculation herself, the way her father had taught her, and they said clearly and without sentiment that this was a job for more people. The question was whether she would ask. She'd spent her whole life not asking. Not because she was too proud exactly, but because asking and receiving had for most of her 21 years come with a cost. She wasn't interested in paying the particular cost of being in debt to people who made sure you didn't forget it. The Pruitts had been the clearest version of that, but they weren't the first. She thought about it for a week, while she continued preparing what she could prepare alone. She thought about what it would mean to be the kind of person who asked for help when help was actually needed, rather than the kind who refused help until the situation was critical and the refusal became its own kind of pride. It was Clara Finch who finally said what everyone in town had apparently been thinking. Eliza. Clara set down her coffee cup at the kitchen table one morning with a particular firmness that meant she'd decided something. You know the town has been watching you work for 6 weeks. I know, Eliza said. You know that half of Main Street has an opinion about what you're doing and when you're going to let someone give you a hand. I've noticed that people have opinions. What I'm telling you, Clara said, with the directness of a woman who had been listening to other people be indirect for 57 years and had lost patience with the practice, is that asking for help is not the same as owing something. Not here. Not with people who've watched you work honestly for 6 weeks and respect it. She picked up her coffee cup. You've been treating this town like it's going to charge you for its goodwill. Most people here aren't like that. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Most, she said. Most, Clara agreed. That's the honest version. But the ones that matter are solid. Eliza turned her coffee cup in her hands. It was a habit she had when she was thinking, and Clara had stopped commenting on it. If I asked Jonah Bell to organize a roof raising, she said finally, how many people do you think would actually come? Clara looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between fond and exasperated. I think you'd be surprised, she said, by how many people have been waiting for you to ask. She went to Jonah Bell's workshop that afternoon. He was working on a door frame when she came in, fitting the pieces together on his work table with the focused attention he gave to all his work. He looked up. I need to ask you something, she said. A professional question first, and then something else. Go ahead. The roof. To do it properly, to do it in a way that's going to hold for 20 years, how many people does the framing phase actually require? He set down his plane. Minimum 6. 8 is better. The ridge beam alone needs 4 people to lift and set without warping the wall plate. And if I asked you to organize it, she said, as the professional in charge, would you be willing to do that? He looked at her. Who would I be asking? Whoever you think is solid, she said. Clara's word, not mine, but I think it's the right one. He was quiet for a moment. I've got 3 men who owe me favors, he said. There's the blacksmith Holt. He's strong, and he doesn't mind working alongside. Wade Mercer's useful in a physical job, not that he'd say so himself. Calder Rusk if he's in town. He paused. And there are women who'll come for the practical side of it. Clara, the Garrity sisters from the north end of town. They've done this kind of thing before. Eliza listened to him list the names and felt something she hadn't expected, not gratitude exactly, but something adjacent to it, something that had more weight. These were people she'd been living alongside for 6 weeks, trading words with at the general store, nodding to on the main street, working near, without quite working with. They were not her people yet. But Jonah Bell was saying them out loud like they might become that, and she found she didn't have the instinct she'd expected to push that away. All right, she said. All right, you'd like me to organize it? All right, she said again. Yes. He pulled out his notebook. Saturday week, he said. That gives me time to get the materials staged and the people sorted. Saturday week, she said. She left his workshop and walked back toward her homestead through the late afternoon. The town was in its end of day. Quiet, the blacksmith's hammer had stopped, the general stores was dimming its lights. A couple of horses stood at the rail outside the saloon with the patient resignation of horses at the end of a long day. She walked through it and thought about Saturday week, and about Clara's words solid, and about what it meant to be the kind of person who could be built into a community without losing the particular shape of herself in the process. She was not sure she knew how to do that yet. She'd never had the practice. But she was beginning to understand, in the specific and particular way of things learned through difficulty rather than instruction, that the gold in her floorboard was not what was going to determine what her life in Dustwater Springs amounted to. What was going to determine it was whether she could figure out how to let people in without disappearing in the process. She stopped at the homestead and looked at the standing stone walls, solid and old and waiting, open to the sky. Saturday week, she thought, and then she rolled up her sleeves and went back to work on the things she could still do alone. Saturday came in cold and clear, the kind of autumn morning that made the air taste like metal and made everything look sharper than it actually was. Eliza was at the homestead before first light. She'd been there since 5 a.m, moving the staged materials into better positions, running through Jonah Bell's plan in her head one more time, the way she always did with anything important, not because she didn't trust the plan, but because her brain didn't know how to let a thing rest until she'd held it up against the light from every angle. The ridge beam was laid out along the south wall, 10 feet of hand-hewn timber that Jonah had sourced from a mill 40 miles north. The wall plates were already set, that part she and Jonah had done together on the Thursday before. A 3-hour job that had left her arms feeling like borrowed equipment. The rafters were stacked and numbered. Everything was ready. She stood in the center of what would be her main room and looked up at the open sky and breathed in the cold air and tried to settle the thing in her chest that wasn't quite anxiety but was adjacent to it. She was waiting for people to show up, which was a simple enough thing on the surface. The complication was that she'd spent so many years making herself self-sufficient specifically, so she wouldn't have to wait for anyone, that the act of waiting felt strange and exposed and harder than she'd expected it to feel. She heard them before she saw them. Voices coming from the main street direction, more than one. Then boots on the hardpan, and the road outside her property, and then Jonah Bell came around the corner of the standing wall with a man she recognized as Holt, the blacksmith, a broad, quiet man of about 40 who communicated mostly through the positioning of his body rather than actual words, and 2 other men she knew by sight but not yet by name. "You're already here," Jonah said. It wasn't a question. "I'm always already here," she said. He set down his toolbox and looked at the staged materials with the assessing eye of someone who'd built enough things to know immediately whether the prep work had been done correctly. He looked at it for a moment, and she could see him finding that it had. "Good staging," he said. "I had the plan," she said. "I just followed it." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and went to speak to Holt. They arrived in 1s and 2s over the next half hour. Alger Russ came with his mule, which turned out to be a practical addition nobody had specifically planned for, but which solved 2 problems before 9 o'clock. Wade Mercer arrived in his work clothes rather than his sheriff's clothes, which somehow changed him into a different version of himself, quieter, easier in his body, more willing to take direction. He had a young deputy with him who was eager in a way that made Eliza keep him away from anything structural until Jonah gave him a specific job. The Garrity sisters came together, 2 women in their early 40s, named Ruth and Josephine, with the efficient movements of people who had worked outdoors most of their lives, and didn't need anyone to explain the basic physics of cooperative labor. They looked at the staged materials, looked at each other, and without consulting anyone, began organizing the rope and pulley equipment that Jonah had set out, improving its arrangement in a way that Jonah noticed and approved of without making a production of the approval. Clara Finch arrived with a large covered pot, which she set on a flat stone well clear of the work area, and then immediately took up a position as the person who kept track of where everything was and what came next, a role nobody assigned her, that she simply occupied because it needed occupying, and she could see that it did. 8 people in total, including Eliza, plus the mule. She stood at the edge of the work area and looked at all of them, these people who had come on a Saturday morning to help her, put a roof on a ruined cabin, and felt something pull at something in her chest that she needed a moment to get under control. She got it under control. She picked up her work gloves, pulled them on, and went to find out what Jonah needed her doing first. The answer was quite a lot. She'd understood the plan intellectually. She'd read Jonah's materials and his staging diagram and his sequence notes, and she'd understood what each step required and roughly how long it would take. What she hadn't been able to fully calculate from reading the plan was what it felt like to be inside it, to be one of 8 people working on the same structure at the same time, each one doing a specific piece, the whole thing moving forward as a collective rather than as one person doing everything in sequence. Her father had worked in survey crews. He'd tried to explain that to her once, the way a crew of 8 moved across terrain differently than one person did, the way the knowledge distributed and compensated and made things possible that weren't possible alone. She'd nodded at the time because she understood it abstractly. Now she understood it in her hands. The ridge beam went up at 10:30. It was the moment everything either worked or it didn't, the moment when the whole preparation resolved into either a functional structure or a significant problem. Jonah had run the calculations twice. Holt and Mercer and Calder and Jonah himself were on the lifting end, with ropes through the pulley Calder's mule was anchoring, and Ruth Garrity was at the east wall plate, and Eliza was at the west. And for about 45 seconds, everything was noise and effort, and the specific tension of a thing happening that cannot be undone midway. The ridge beam seated. It seated cleanly, which was not guaranteed, and she had not been certain it would. It seated against both wall plates, with the solid, definitive sound of weight finding its proper resting place, and Jonah was up on the east wall plate within 10 seconds to check the seating and the level, and he called out that it was good, and the tension that had been holding everyone went out of the air like a breath released. Someone whooped. She was fairly certain it was the young deputy. She pressed both palms flat against the west wall plate for a moment, feeling the vibration of the set beam still traveling through the stone, and allowed herself exactly one moment of something uncomplicated and warm before she turned around and told Holt they needed to get the first rafter pairs in position before the morning got any older. Holt looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who expressed things easily, but he nodded with a quality that meant more than a nod usually did, and went to get the rafters. By noon they had half the roof framed. By mid-afternoon, 2/3. Clara called a rest at 2 o'clock, with the authority of someone who understood that people working hard for 6 hours on a cold morning needed to stop, or they'd start making mistakes. And everyone came down from their positions and ate from the pot and drank the coffee that Clara had also somehow produced from somewhere and stood around in the pale autumn sun talking. This was the part Eliza hadn't planned for, the work she'd been ready for. 8 years of watching her father operate in field conditions had given her a practical education in how physical labor actually went, the problems that came up, the adjustments required, the specific exhaustion of sustained effort. She'd moved through the morning's work with more confidence than she'd expected to feel, even when things didn't go exactly as planned, which they hadn't twice. But standing in the courtyard of her own homestead with 7 other people eating Clara's cooking and talking easily around her that she hadn't prepared for, and she wasn't sure she could have. Josephine Garrity sat down next to her on the fieldstone bench and said, without preamble, "You ever done a roof before?" "No," Eliza said. "Not a full one." Didn't look like a first time. Josephine ate a spoonful of whatever Clara had made beans, mostly with something smoky and satisfying underneath. "My sister and I did our barn roof 6 years ago, just the 2 of us, which was a mistake, but we got it done." She paused. "Took 3 times as long, and we argued about the ridge beam for 2 days. I almost argued with myself about it," Eliza said. "I was reading Jonah's calculations at midnight 3 nights ago, second-guessing the slope calculation." Josephine looked at her. "Were you right?" "No. Jonah's calculation was correct. That's the worst kind of second-guessing." Josephine went back to her food. It was the kind of conversation that didn't mean much on the surface and meant quite a lot underneath it. And Eliza sat with it after Josephine moved on to talk to Ruth, turning it over. In her experience, people used small talk either to get something or to avoid something. The Garrity sisters didn't appear to be doing either. They just seemed to be talking because they were there and she was there, and that was sufficient reason. She was still adjusting to the idea that sufficient reason was sometimes genuinely sufficient. Jonah came and sat where Josephine had been. He ate standing up normally, she'd noticed, but he sat down now, which was a small thing she filed away. He looked at the partially framed roof, the ridge beam running the length of the cabin, the rafter pairs already set at regular intervals along the first 2/3 of its length, with the expression of someone making an ongoing and quiet assessment. "We'll finish the framing today," he said. "Sheathing we'll do next week, that's a smaller crew. Can be done with 4. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about the sheathing sequence." He glanced at her sideways. "You have you? I'll share my thoughts if they're different from yours. If they're the same, I won't bother you with them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I've been thinking about the eastern overhang. The original cabin didn't have one, but the way the drainage runs on that side of the property, you'll get water intrusion at the east wall base within a few years if there's no overhang to push the runoff clear." She looked at the east wall. She thought about the drainage line. He was right. She could see it now that he said it, the way the ground sloped toward the east foundation. "I'd been thinking about that," she said, "but I didn't want to expand the project scope without discussing it. It's not a significant expansion. 2 extra tails, extended sheathing." He ate the last of his food. "Worth doing while we have the framing open." "Agreed," she said. He stood all right. He looked at the roof, then at her. "Your father taught you to think in structures." "He did. Good teacher he was." She paused. "Had died without me having told him so directly." Jonah Bell looked at her with the particular care of a man who understood what it meant to say something like that quietly, without asking for anything in return. He nodded once, picked up his empty bowl, and went back to work. The rest returned to the framing within 20 minutes of Clara, calling the rest. The afternoon was colder than the morning, the light flatter, but the work had its own heat in it, the particular warmth of sustained physical labor, of people moving in coordination toward a specific and visible goal. Eliza moved through the afternoon with her work gloves worn through at 2 fingertips, and her back making its opinion clear out the rope work she'd been doing all morning, and she didn't stop. By 4 o'clock, the framing was complete. Not the roof, the sheathing, and the final weatherproofing were still ahead, as Jonah had said, but the bones of it were there. The ridge beam, the rafter pairs running from it down to the wall plates at regular intervals. The structure that would hold everything above her head for the next 20 years. She stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked up at it against the late afternoon sky, and felt the solidity of it in a way she hadn't expected to feel. It wasn't finished, but it was real, it was hers. Mercer came to stand beside her. He'd been one of the strongest workers all day, she'd noticed that. The way he worked steadily without needing to make anything of it, and he had the same worn, satisfied look that everyone had at the end of a day of physical work done correctly. "Good bones," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You know, when you first came into my office, I thought you were either very naive or very stubborn." "Why not both?" she said. He made a sound. "Fair." He looked at the framed roof. The notation went into the archive on Friday, properly filed, indexed, attached to the original inquiry record. Anyone who pulls the Black Creek file from now on will see both documents. She'd known this was coming. He'd told her it would be done by end of week, but hearing it stated plainly still settled something in her that had been holding its weight in a specific way since she'd handed him that copy of Silas Crow's letter more than a month ago. "Thank you," she said, "for doing it properly." "It's the job," he said. But the way he said it meant something different from the bureaucratic version of that phrase. He left with the deputy shortly after. Calder Rusk lingered. He and Eliza had developed the kind of friendship that didn't require schedule or ceremony, that just existed in the spaces around other things and helped her secure the exposed framing for overnight before he headed back to wherever he was currently camped, which was never quite the same place twice. The Garrity sisters said their goodbyes with the same directness they brought to everything else. Ruth said, "Good work," which from Ruth appeared to be the highest available form of praise, and Josephine said she'd be interested in helping with the sheathing if Eliza needed another pair of hands, and Eliza said she'd be grateful for it. Clara was last. She'd washed the pot and packed up her things and was standing at the property edge with her coat buttoned against the cold, looking at the cabin the way she'd been looking at it all day, not like someone inspecting, but like someone who had a stake in it that she hadn't announced. "Come for dinner tonight," Clara said, "not the arrangement. Just dinner." Eliza looked at her. "All right," she said. Clara nodded and walked back toward her boarding house. Eliza stayed at the homestead until the light was almost gone, walking the perimeter of the structure, checking that everything was secure, running her hands along wall plates and the base of the raft repairs where they seat against the stone. She was doing what she always did at the end of a phase of work, confirming that what she believed to be solid was actually solid, not just visually, but in the tactile, immediate way of pressing weight against a thing and feeling it hold. It held. She put her tools away in the corner she'd designated for them, under a canvas to keep the night damp off. She stood in the near dark of her roofless but framed cabin and looked around at it. A month ago this had been a ruin. 4 stone walls and a dirt floor full of other people's debris and the remnant of someone else's failed attempt at a life. Now it was not finished, not livable, not yet everything it was going to be, but it was something. Something that had her hands in every part of it, her decisions in every joint and seam, her understanding in the way the materials were staged, and the drainage was considered, and the east overhang extended 2 feet beyond what the original design called for, because she and Jonah Bell had agreed. That 2 feet would make a difference in 20 years. She thought about Harlan Pruitt looking back at her in the dust and making his calculation. She thought about what that calculation had looked like from his side, the quick, cold arithmetic of usefulness and inconvenience, the same arithmetic that had followed her all her life in one form or another. Too big, too heavy, too much trouble to carry. She thought about the fact that she was standing in her own home, not finished, not easy, not the kind of thing that arrived without cost or difficulty or the specific ache of every muscle she'd used for the past 8 hours, but hers in the specific and particular way that things become yours when you've worked for them with your own hands and your own judgment and your own refusal to give up when the situation suggested you probably should. She picked up her coat and her father's compass and walked to Clara Finch's boarding house for dinner. Clara had made a proper meal, the kind that required actual planning, not just sustaining, and the two of them ate at the kitchen table with the easy quiet of women who had moved past the stage of needing to fill silences with conversation for its own sake. Clara asked a few practical questions about the sheathing timeline. Eliza answered them. They talked about Josephine Garrity, who Clara said was one of the most capable people in Dustwater Springs if you caught her in the right context, and about Holt the blacksmith, who Clara said was a fundamentally decent man who'd had a hard few years after his wife left and had gotten quieter since, but no less dependable. "He stayed until the end today," Eliza said. "He always does," Clara said. "That's the thing about Holt. He doesn't make noise about what he's doing, but he stays until the thing is done." Eliza thought about that. That's a quality worth more than most people account for. Most people account for noise, Clara agreed, which is why they get confused when someone quiet turns out to be the most reliable person in the room. After dinner, Clara put a fresh cup of coffee on the table and sat back down and said, "I want to ask you something, Eliza, and you're free to tell me it's not my business. Go ahead. You've been here 2 months. You've bought a property, filed legal paperwork with the county, sent money to someone in Nebraska." She paused at the look on Eliza's face. "Edwin Pike isn't a gossip. He mentioned it to me because he knew I'd want to know you were all right. He didn't tell anyone else." Eliza settled back. She was going to have to make a decision about Clara, not a dramatic one, just the quiet decision of how much of the truth to extend toward someone who had been, in every way that counted, more decent to her than most people she'd ever worked for or alongside. The money was a debt, she said. Not mine originally, but I was in a position to settle it, so I did. A debt from who? Someone who died before he could settle it himself. She paused. That's the honest version. The rest of it is complicated in ways I'm not ready to explain yet. Clara looked at her with the steady gaze of a woman who had spent 57 years reading people accurately enough to stay out of situations that didn't serve her. "You're not doing anything illegal," she said. "No, and you're not in danger. Not that I know of." "All right." Clara picked up her coffee. "Then the rest of it can wait until you're ready." It was the right response, and it was exactly what Eliza would have hoped for without knowing how to ask for it. The acceptance without the interrogation, the trust extended without being earned through full disclosure. She'd had so few experiences of that in her 21 years that she wasn't sure she'd recognized it immediately when it came. Most of its windows were dark. She went back to her homestead that night and lay on the cot she'd set up in the corner of the main room. It wasn't weatherproof yet, but the night was dry and cold, and the walls blocked enough wind that the 2 blankets she had were sufficient, and looked up at the framed roof against the night sky. The rafter pairs ran at their regular intervals above her, the ridge beam at the center, and through the open sheathing she could see stars. She put her father's compass on her chest, the way she'd done in the desert, and let her eyes trace the constellations she could name. Her father had taught her those too. Of course he had. The sheathing took most of the following week. Jonah Bell came every day, and Josephine Garrity made good on her offer, and came 3 of the 5 days, and Calder Rusk came once with lumber he'd sourced from somewhere he declined to specify, but which was good quality and appropriately priced, so she didn't press. The works was slower and more painstaking than the framing. The sheathing required precision in a way that the framing's structural logic had made somewhat self-correcting, and there were 2 afternoons where she and Jonah had a disagreement about the best approach to a specific problem and worked through it by trying both approaches on smaller sections before settling on his, which she acknowledged was correct, and one afternoon where she was right, and he acknowledged it with the same lack of drama. They developed a working language over that week. Not friendship exactly, or not yet, or not in a way she could fully name, but a professional respect that had some warmth in it, some ease, the specific comfort of working consistently with someone whose judgment you'd learned to read. He didn't ask her about herself. He talked about his work, about the buildings he'd made in Dustwater Springs and the surrounding area, about the particular challenges of frontier construction where materials were expensive and distances were long, and you had to solve problems with what you had rather than what you wished you had. She talked about structural principles and drainage, and her father's approach to survey work, and occasionally they sat at the end of a working day on the framed and now half-sheathed roof and watched the sun go down over the Sandres Range in the distance without saying anything at all. On the Friday of the sheathing week, he said, "I'll need to put the final weathering layer on next week. You can do most of it yourself at that point. It's individual work, not a coordination problem. But," he looked at her sideways, he'd figured out over the week that she heard the unspoken parts of things. "But if you wanted help with the final layer, I'd be available on Thursday." She looked out at the last of the light over the mountains. "I'd be glad of the company," she said. It was a different thing to say than "I'd appreciate the help," and she'd chosen it deliberately, and she thought Jonah Bell understood the difference. He nodded, and climbed down from the roof, and said goodnight, and walked back toward town. She finished the sheathing herself on Monday and Tuesday and most of Wednesday. She worked in the mornings and the early afternoons because the cold had started to come in harder and the light was changing, the days getting shorter. On Thursday, Jonah came, and they put the final weathering layer on together, working from opposite ends of the roof toward the center, and when they met in the middle and set the last section, and it was mid-afternoon, and the light was going flat and golden across the desert to the east. She stood on the ground and looked up at it, a roof, her roof on her walls over her floor above her life. Jonah stood beside her and looked up at it too. He had sawdust on his coat and a cut on one knuckle from a tool that had slipped on Wednesday, and his hair was doing something the morning wind had started, and the day's work had continued. Most of its windows were dark, and he was looking at the finished roof with an expression that was the same expression he'd had every time he'd looked at a thing he'd built and confirmed it was good. "Tight," he said. "Yes," she said, "the east overhang's going to work." "I know." She'd been watching the drainage during the one rain they'd had midweek, a small desert rain that hadn't lasted long, but had been enough to show her exactly how the water moved across the property. The overhang pushed it exactly where she and Jonah had calculated it would go, away from the east wall base into the natural depression she'd been slowly shaping into a directed drainage channel. "You were right to suggest it. You were already thinking about it," he said. "I was thinking about the problem. You had the specific solution." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a decent way to work with someone," he said, "when you can tell the difference between those two things." She looked at him. He was still looking at the roof, and she couldn't entirely read his expression, which was unusual. She'd spent the better part of a month learning to read him. "It's how my father worked," she said. "He said the most useful person in a crew wasn't necessarily the one with the most knowledge. It was the one who could tell the difference between having a problem and having a solution." Jonah finally looked at her. "Your father sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," she said. "I didn't appreciate it clearly enough until I was in situations where his voice was all I had." The light was going now, the last of the afternoon warmth fading. She could feel the cold starting to build at the edges of it, the kind that in another few weeks would serious and required attention. "I owe you a significant debt," she said. "For this. For all of it, the consulting, the materials, the time, the Saturday roof raising. I want to pay you properly." "You've been paying as we go," he said. "Not fully." She'd been paying him for materials at cost, and for labor at the rate he'd quoted, which was a fair rate, and she'd paid it without argument. Most of its windows were dark, but she knew what this project would have cost with a different contractor, and the difference between what she'd paid and what it would have cost elsewhere was real. "What you've paid is fair," he said. "Jonah." She said his name the way she said things when she needed someone to hear her precisely. "I'm going to be honest with you. I have more resources than I came into this town looking like I had. I'm not going to explain all of it, because some of it is complicated in ways that are mine to carry. But I don't want to underpay people who've done real work for me, because I came in looking like someone who couldn't afford it." He looked at her for a long time. The light was almost gone now, the roof above them going from amber to gray in the dusk. "All right," he said. "We can settle up properly. Thank you." He picked up his toolbox. "You've got a solid house," he said. "The rest of it, the interior work, the outbuilding. Eventually you'll figure that out in the right order." "I know what order it goes in," she said. He almost smiled. It was the almost that she'd gotten used to the way he stopped just short of it. Not from coldness, but from some habit of restraint that had probably been useful at some point and had stayed past its usefulness. "I know you do," he said. He left and she went inside, and for the first time she stood in her home with a roof over her head. The walls were stone and solid. The floor was dirt, but it was her dirt. The light was almost completely gone, and she hadn't yet made any of the interior improvements she was planning. There was no furniture worth mentioning, no proper stove yet, just the cot in the corner and the tin box under the floorboard, and her tools stacked in their canvas. But it was enclosed. It was whole. Wind could no longer come through the absent ceiling, and it could no longer rain on the inside of her house. She lit the small lamp she'd bought at Sully's general store and set it on the board she'd been using as a table, and sat on the fieldstone she'd been using as a chair and looked at the light moving on the stone walls of her home. She thought about the night in the desert when she decided she was not going to die out there because Harlan Pruitt had calculated that she wasn't worth turning around for. She thought about every version of that calculation she'd encountered in 21 years, the families who'd employed her to treated her as furniture that could carry its own weight, the towns she'd passed through, where people had looked at her body and drawn their conclusions before she'd said a word, the endless small adjustments she'd made to herself to accommodate other people's comfort with what she looked like. She thought about the fact that she was sitting in her own home, paid for with her own money, built with her own hands and the hands of people who had come on a Saturday morning because watched her work honestly for 6 weeks and decided she'd earned it. The lamplight moved on the old fieldstone walls that someone a generation ago had laid with care, that had stood through years of neglect and weather and the collapsed weight of a failed roof, that most of us, for someone to see the value in what they were before they'd been abandoned. She reached into her coat pocket and took out the small carved wooden bird she'd found in the sandstone shelter Silas Crow's, or someone's before him, worn smooth by handling, small enough to sit in her palm. She set it on the board beside the lamp. Then she took out her father's compass and set it on the other side. 2 objects, 2 different kinds of navigation. She sat with them for a while in the lamplight, in her enclosed and roofed and imperfect and unfinished home, and let herself feel the weight of what she'd built. Not just the structure. All of it, the record in the county archive, the bank draft in Nebraska, the roof overhead, the people who'd stood on her walls with her on a Saturday morning, the whole complicated, expensive, sometimes frightening construction of a life that was starting to belong to her in ways she hadn't known she was allowed to want. Outside, the wind moved across the desert and found the east overhang and was redirected away from her walls exactly as calculated. She stayed awake for a long time, listening to her house hold against the wind. The letter from Nebraska arrived on a Thursday in late November, 6 weeks after Eliza had stood at the post office window and handed the envelope to the clerk. She almost missed it. She'd been at the homestead all morning working on the interior. She'd started on the flooring 2 weeks ago, replacing the damaged sections of old plank with new lumber she'd sourced from the same mill Jonah had used for the roof timbers, working from the walls inward, the way her father had taught her, to approach any surface problem, establishing your perimeter first before you committed to the center. Her hands were rough with sawdust, and her knees ached from the kneeling work, and she was thinking about the stove installation she'd been planning and what sequence it needed to go in flue before fitting, obviously, but the flue required a specific cut through the roof she'd been reluctant to make until she was certain of the placement when Clara Finch appeared at the cabin doorway with an envelope in her hand. "Post office sent it over," Clara said. "The clerk knew you'd been waiting." She hadn't told the clerk she'd been waiting. She'd been careful not to. But Dustover Springs was a small town, and small towns had their own intelligence networks that operated without announcement, and apparently at some point it had become common knowledge that Eliza Wren was waiting for a letter from Nebraska. She took the envelope. She set down her tools. She sat on the new floor section she'd laid that morning and looked at it. The handwriting on the front was a man's deliberate, unpracticed, the kind of script produced by some Simpson who wrote infrequently and tried to be legible when he did. Her name and the Dustwater Springs address. The return address was a county in Nebraska she'd had to look up on a map to confirm existed. Clara was still in the doorway, not hovering. That wasn't Clara's way, just present, in the manner of someone who understood that certain moments required a witness without requiring participation. Eliza opened the letter. It was 3 pages, written front and back on paper that had been smoothed and folded, and was slightly wavy at the edges, in the way paper gets when it's been handled by someone who has picked it up and put it down several times before finally writing on it. Miss Wren. Dear Miss Wren, I will say outright that I don't know exactly how to write this letter because I don't have much experience with the kind of thing you've done, and I want to make sure I say it right. My name is Denton Vance. I farm 120 acres in Nebraska that have been in my family since my great-great-grandmother homesteaded them after the Civil War. Nathan Vance, whose name you mentioned in your letter, was my great-great-uncle. I knew his name from family stories and from a notification my family received years ago saying he'd been killed in a railroad robbery, not much more than that. Nobody in my family knew much about how it actually happened. We knew he was young. We knew he died somewhere in New Mexico. That was the whole of it. Your letter was the first time anyone had told my family that Nathan died with his hands up, that he was surrendering, that a man saw it happen and carried the guilt of it for 30 years and wrote it down. I've read your letter 4 times now. My wife has read it. My oldest son has read it. We sat at the kitchen table and my wife cried, which she doesn't do often, and I didn't cry, but I came close, which I also don't do often. I don't know how you found us. I don't know how you came to have this information. Your letter didn't explain, and I'm not asking you to explain. Whatever brought you to this, you did something that mattered to people you've never met. That's not a small thing. Most people don't do things that matter to people they've never met. She stopped reading. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth for a moment, not because she was going to cry she wasn't, or not yet, or not in front of Clara, but because something in her chest needed a moment to catch up to what was happening. She kept reading. The money, I need to talk about the money, because I've been going back and forth about it since the bank draft arrived, and I haven't settled on a clean way to feel about it. We've had 3 bad drought years. I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because the evidence is on every field on this property, and I'm not too proud to say plainly what's true. We were looking at losing the East 40 before winter. We'd already sold equipment we could sell and talked to the bank twice about the mortgage, and neither conversation went the way we'd hoped. My wife knows what the situation was. My kids are old enough to understand parts of it. The draft you sent us cleared the debt on the East 40 and left enough to get us to next growing season. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. Your letter said it was an old debt, finally settled. I've thought about that. I think you're right. I think Nathan Vance was something because you can balance a 19-year-old boy's life against money. You can't, but because he was left unacknowledged for 90 years and his family was left not knowing what had actually happened to him or whether anyone cared. That's its own kind of debt. You settled both kinds, and I don't know how you did it or what it cost you, but I'm grateful in a way I don't have adequate words for. What I can say is this land will stay in our family. That matters more than I know how to tell you. It's not just land. It's Nathan's family's land. It's the land his sister homesteaded when she came back from burying him. It's the land my father worked and his father before that. Losing it would have been the end of something that goes back farther than I can trace clearly. It's not ending. I'd like to write to you again, if that's all right. Not to repay anything I understand that isn't what you wanted. Just because you did something decent for my family, and I'd like to know that you're all right. If you're not interested in that, I understand, and I thank you anyway. Denton Vance P.S. My wife asked me to add that if you're ever in Nebraska, you have a place at our table. She was very specific that I include this. Eliza sat on her new floor with the letter in both hands and looked at it for a long time. Clara said quietly, from the doorway, "Good news?" Eliza looked up. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out even, which surprised her a little. "Very good news." Clara nodded. She didn't ask anything else. She said she'd leave Eliza to it, and she did, and her footsteps receded across the property and back toward the main street. And Eliza sat alone in her unfinished home and read the letter one more time. Slowly, the way she read things that mattered. She thought about Silas Crow in the desert, writing by whatever light he had. Writing because he needed the truth to exist somewhere outside his own head before he ran out of time. She thought about what he'd want, not forgiveness. He hadn't asked for that. He'd known himself too clearly to think he was owed it. Just for the record to exist. Just for Nathan Vance's hands up. Kneeling surrender to be written down somewhere that someone might eventually find. The record existed. The family knew. The land was still theirs. She folded the letter carefully and put it inside her coat, next to her father's compass, as in Silas Crow's original confession. 3 documents carried close to her body. She sat with the weight of all of them for a moment, and then she stood up, picked up her tools, and went back to the floor. She was still working when Jonah Bell came by in the early afternoon. He'd developed a habit, she'd noticed it over the past weeks, of stopping at the homestead on his way back from other jobs. Not daily and not announced. He'd appear in the doorway, look at what she'd done, sometimes offer a specific technical observation, sometimes say nothing much at all. She'd learned to tell the difference between the 2 kinds of visits and respond accordingly. Today he looked at the floor section she'd laid, checked the joints with his eye, the way he always did, and said, "You're running the boards the wrong direction for that corner." She looked at the corner in question. She looked at what she'd planned. She looked back at the corner. "Explain," she said. He came in and crouched down and showed her the way the grain was running relative to where she was placing the stove, the foot traffic patterns in a room this size, the specific problem that would develop at the corner joint in 3 or 4 years if the boards ran the way she'd laid them. He wasn't wrong. She could see it clearly once he'd said it, which was the particular frustration of being shown a mistake by someone whose judgment you trusted. "I can relay that section," she said. "It's 4 boards. 30 minutes, I know." She sat back on her heels. "I was thinking about the stove placement when I laid it, and I let the one problem crowd out the other. It happens." He stood. "You want a hand with the relay? I can do it." "I know you can do it," he said, with the same patience he'd been deploying for weeks in response to her reflexive insistence on doing things herself. "That's not what I asked." She looked up at him. He had that almost expression again, the one that stopped short of something. She'd been thinking about that expression more than was probably useful. She'd reached the provisional conclusion that it stopped short not from restraint, but from uncertainty, that Jonah Bell, who was precise and direct about everything structural, was not always precise and direct about everything else. "You can help with the relay," she said. "Thank you." They relayed the 4 boards in 25 minutes, which was faster than 30 as he'd estimated, and fast enough to suggest they'd developed a working efficiency that neither of them had explicitly discussed, but both of them had apparently internalized. He cut, she fitted. She held, he secured. They didn't talk through most of it, which was comfortable in the way that silence between people becomes when the silence is chosen rather than imposed. When they finished, he sat back and looked at it. Better, he said. Yes. She looked at the corrected section. I'll remember the grain direction argument for the next sections. You'll remember it anyway, he said. You remember everything structural, not everything. I missed this. You were thinking about two problems at once. He paused. Your father, did he ever tell you that the hardest thing in field work wasn't solving problems, it was knowing which problem to solve first? She looked at him. He said exactly that, in different words. My father was a cabinet maker, Jonah said. He said it about cabinets. I think it applies to most things. She hadn't known that his father had been a cabinet maker. In the weeks they'd been working together, she'd learned pieces of him the way you learn pieces of anyone through sustained proximity. But he was not a man who offered autobiography easily, and she hadn't pushed. This was the first time he'd mentioned his father. Was he a good teacher, she asked? He was exacting, Jonah said, which is a different thing from good, but it gets results. He looked at the floor. He died when I was 22. I'd been working with him for 4 years by then, long enough to have learned most of what he knew, short enough that I hadn't finished arguing with him about the parts I thought I knew better. He paused. Turns out I was right about 2 of them and wrong about 4. Eliza understood that accounting. The precise inventory of what you'd known and what you'd missed and what you'd argued about and never gotten to resolve. She'd been keeping her own version of it since her father's heart had stopped between survey stakes in Colorado, and it didn't get shorter with time, but it did get less sharp. The way any wound does not heal. Exactly, but no longer cutting the same way every time you turned. I was right about most things my father taught me, she said. But I wasn't done arguing with him either. Jonah looked at her with an expression that was not the almost something this time, but something more direct and quieter. You're doing something he'd recognize, he said. What you're building here, the way you're building it. He gestured at the floor, the walls, the roof above them. He'd recognized the approach. She didn't answer for a moment. She looked at her floor that she'd laid mostly with her own hands, and at the walls around her and the roof overhead. That might be the best thing anyone said to me in a long time, she said. He nodded. He picked up his coat from where he'd set it and put it on. I've got a door frame to deliver this afternoon, he said. South end of town. But I can come back tomorrow if you want help with the stove positioning. I'd appreciate that, she said. He was at the doorway when she said, Jonah. He stopped and looked back. Your father's exacting nature, she said. You carry it. I can see it in how you work. That's not a criticism, it's the best kind of inheritance. He stood there for a moment. Whatever the almost expression was moving toward, it got closer than usual, and then settled back, and he nodded once and left. She sat alone in her home for a while after that, listening to his footsteps diminish in the direction of the main street, and then she picked up her tools and got back to work. Winter arrived properly in the first week of December. Not the warning cold of November, but the real thing, nights that dropped below freezing, mornings with frost on the east wall, the kind of weather that separated the adequate from the inadequate in terms of shelter. Eliza's roof held. The east overhang performed exactly as she and Jonah had calculated, directing the drainage away from the wall base. The stove she'd had Holt the blacksmith help her install in the second week of November threw heat efficiently enough to make the main room genuinely warm within an hour of lighting, which was better than she dared to expect from a first winter in a newly restored structure. She slept well. She woke early. She worked. The interior came together over the course of December in stages that were less dramatic than the roof raising, but no less satisfying a proper table she'd built herself from lumber scraps. Using joinery techniques Jonah had shown her over a series of afternoons that had been, she thought, as much about the company as the carpentry. 2 chairs, a set of shelves along the north wall for her tools and her supplies, and the few books she'd acquired, a practical guide to frontier agriculture that Garrett Sully had had in the back of the general store and practically given her for what he charged, and 2 novels she'd found in a box. Clara was clearing out, one of which was excellent, and one of which was not what she read anyway because she'd started it. She built a proper bed frame in the second week of December, which felt like a milestone of a specific and practical kind. She'd been sleeping on the cot since she'd moved in properly after the roof was done, and the cot was functional, In the same way that surviving in the desert had been functional, it worked. And that was its entire case for itself. The bed frame was something different. It was built to last, built for comfort within the limits of what she had, built for a life rather than a situation. She laid in it the first night and stared up at the underside of her roof and thought about how different it was from staring up at the underside of a wagon canvas, which was what she'd done for 14 months working for the Pruitts. She thought about Vera Pruitt calling her sturdy when she was being generous. She thought about her own body not in the way she'd spent years thinking about it, which was defensively as a thing to be managed and minimized and kept from inconveniencing other people's eyes. She thought about it in the way she'd started thinking about it since the desert, as the thing that had carried her across of badlands on a bad ankle without water. Just were dark, as the thing that had cleared debris and laid floor and hoisted rope and helped set a ridge beam and did not ask her permission before doing what it needed to do in a crisis, as the thing that ached after a long day's work and kept working anyway and was not elegant about it and didn't need to be. Her father had never said anything about her body except that it was capable. He'd said that once, directly, when she was 12 and had hauled a survey stake out of rock-hard ground that one of his assistants had given up on. He'd watched her do it and then said, simply capable, and moved on to the next stake. She had not understood at 12 that this was a gift. She understood it now. Dustwater Springs settled into its winter rhythms around her. The saloon was busier on cold evenings. She'd noticed people looking for warmth and company in roughly equal measure. The general store moved its inventory toward winter supplies, and Garrett Sully had started the stove burning in the back room and offering coffee to customers who weren't in a hurry, which was a kindness wrapped in practicality in the way that the best frontier kindnesses usually were. She fell into the town's rhythms, the way water finds the shape of the container it's in, not because she'd stopped being herself, but because the container was decent enough that fitting into it didn't require deformation. She had dinner at Clara's twice a week, where the arrangement had long since stopped being about the work for meals trade and become simply between two women who'd found in each other a kind of company that neither of them had specifically been looking for, and both of them had apparently needed. She stopped at the sheriff's office occasionally, not because she had legal business, but because Mercer was good conversation, and she'd learned that he had an unexpected and private interest in historical records that went well beyond professional obligation. He'd been corresponding with an archivist in Santa Fe about the Black Creek Inquiry, and the archivist had written back with supplementary material that he'd read with the genuine excitement of a man encountering a story he'd had a hand in adding to. The archivist wants to include the Crow notation in a historical compilation he's putting together. Mercer told her one afternoon, sitting in his office with the relevant correspondence spread on his desk. Frontier crime and its aftermath, that kind of thing. Legal records that got corrected later. What did you tell him? Eliza said. I told him to write to Edwin Pike, since it's Pike's filing officially. He paused. Pike said yes. She sat with that. Silas Crow's confession, her copy of it, the one she'd given Mercer, the one that was now attached to the county historical record, was going to be in a published compilation somewhere. More people were going to read it. More people were going to read it. More people were going to know that Nathan Vassens had died with his hands up, and that someone had seen it, and carried it, and written it down. Silas Crow asked for a record, she said. He's getting more than he asked for, Mercer said. Yes, she said. I think he'd be surprised. Mercer looked at her with the careful, observing expression she'd grown to recognize, the one that meant he was adding something to his ongoing assessment of her, which she suspected was considerably more detailed than he let on. You know what I've been trying to figure out, he said. Tell me how a 21-year-old woman who came into my office 2 months ago with a 90-year-old letter and a bruised face managed to understand immediately and instinctively what the letter was worth and what it required. He paused. Most people would have taken the letter and used it as I don't know. Curiosity. Dinner conversation. They wouldn't have walked into a county sheriff's office and asked for a formal record amendment. Eliza thought about how to answer that. Silas Crow wasn't asking for much, she said finally. He wasn't asking to be forgiven or exonerated or remembered well. He was asking for the truth to exist outside of his own head. That seemed like the least anyone could do. She looked at her hands. "And I knew what it felt like to have people make decisions about you without your participation, to have your version of events simply not included. I didn't want that to be the end of his story, or Nathan Vance's." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "That's a plain way of putting a complicated thing. My father liked plain language," she said. She left his office and walked home in the winter afternoon light, the cold settling around her like something familiar and manageable. She walked past the general store where Sully was closing up, and he raised a hand as she passed, and she raised one back. She walked past the blacksmith's, where Holt was banking his fire for the evening, the glow of it warm through the open doors. She walked past Clara's boarding house, where Clara was visible in the lit window of the kitchen, moving in her deliberate and efficient way between the counter and the stove. She turned east past the mill track, and her property came into view. The stone walls, the roof she'd helped build, the lamp she'd left burning in the window before she'd walked to the sheriff's office. The light coming out of that window was the particular light of a room that belongs to someone warm, deliberate, aimed outward. She stood at the edge of her property and looked at it for a moment. It was not a grand house. It was not large or impressive. Visitors who came from elsewhere and saw it for the first time probably saw what it was: a restored frontier cabin, solid work, modest scope, the kind of home a person builds when they don't have resources for more and compensate with care. Nothing about it announced anything. Nothing about it made a claim. But she knew what it had been before she got to it, and she knew what it had taken to make it this, and she knew who had stood on its walls on a cold Saturday morning and helped put the bones of it in place, and she knew what was in the floorboard under the new planks, and she knew what was held inside her coat, and she knew what was waiting in a Nebraska farmer's family memory now that had not been there before. She went inside. The stove was warm. The lamp was lit. The carved wooden bird sat on the mantel she'd built from 2 pieces of stone and a length of timber. She hadn't had a specific plan for the mantel. It had suggested itself during the interior work as a natural consequence of the stove installation. And she'd built it because it seemed right and useful, and because some rooms needed clever things as the rest. The bird on one end, her father's compass on the other. She'd been asked twice now what the bird was. Once by Clara, once by Calder Rusk, both times in passing, in the way of people who noticed a detail and were curious, but not insistent. She'd said both times that it was something she'd found, which was true. What she hadn't said was what she understood it to mean, or not mean exactly, but represent. She wasn't a person who thought easily in symbols. She'd been raised by a surveyor who trusted measurement over metaphor and had given her the same instinct. But she'd been living with the bird for 3 months now, since she'd first carried it out of the sandstone shelter in her coat pocket, and she'd come to understand it the way you come to understand a thing you live alongside long enough. Silas Crow had carved it, probably, or carried it from someone else who had. A small wooden bird, wings slightly spread, worn smooth by a hand that had held it many times. The kind of thing a person keeps because they need something to hold when they're not sure what else to do with their hands. He'd left it in the hollow with the gold. Not the letter he'd placed with deliberate intent, but the bird he'd just left. Maybe because he had nothing else. Maybe because he was going somewhere he wasn't coming back from, and it seemed wrong to take it. She'd carried it out of the desert and across 30 miles and into this town and into this home. She'd set it on the mantel next to her father's compass. One told her where north was. The other told her she wasn't sure exactly. That a man she'd never met had sat in the same rock shelter she'd survived in and tried at the end of his life to do slightly better than he'd done before. That was possible, that it was worth trying, even late, even imperfectly, even when the chance of anyone noticing was uncertain. She sat down in her chair, at her table in her home, and took Denton Vance's letter out of her coat and set it on the table. Then she took Silas Crow's letter out and set it beside it. Then she took her father's brass compass out and set it at the top, between the 2 letters. She looked at the 3 objects for a while. Then she got out the paper and the pen she'd bought at Sulcy's store. The second week she'd been in Dustwater Springs, meaning to write a letter and not having known yet who to write it to. She'd been carrying the intent of the letter for months before she had the recipient. Now she had both. She wrote to Denton Vance. Not a short letter. She didn't tell him everything. She wasn't going to tell him everything, because some of it wasn't hers to tell, and some of it was hers to carry. But she told him more than she'd told him in the first letter. She told him about the desert, not the gold, not yet. She'd decide later whether that story ever needed telling in full, and she suspected it didn't, suspected that the gold's origin was a thing that served the world better as a permanent omission than as a disclosed fact. But she told him about walking out of the badlands with nothing, about finding shelter in a sandstone cave, about the letter in the hollow in the wall and what she'd understood from reading it. She told him that Nathan Vance's instinct to surrender, to put his hands up, to choose not to fight when fighting was hopeless, was not a failure of courage. It was an exercise of it. The courage to do the sensible and decent thing in a situation designed to make decency look weak. She told him that his family's was going to stay in his family's hands, and that these seemed, to her, like the right outcome of a story that had been going wrong for 90 years. She told him she'd be glad to hear from him again. She signed it, folded it, addressed the envelope. She sat for a while longer at her table in her warm room, with the lamp burning. She thought about what it meant, all of it. The whole accumulated weight of the past 4 months, from the moment she'd been thrown from the wagon to the moment she was sitting here with 2 letters on a table she'd built herself. She was not a person given to large conclusions. Her father had distrusted large conclusions, and she'd inherited the distrust. The desert had reinforced it. The desert didn't care about conclusions. It cared about what you actually did in the next hour. But she allowed herself this. Something had happened that mattered. Not the gold was a fact, a resource, a means. Not the roof or the floor or the property deed, though all of those mattered in the practical ways that shelter and security matter, which were not small ways. What mattered was the thing she kept coming back to when she thought about the specific shape of the past 4 months. She had been left for dead. Not metaphorically, actually, literally left in the desert to die by people who had calculated that she wasn't worth the cost of turning around. And instead of dying, instead of becoming only the story of that abandonment, she had become the person who carried a dead man's conscience out of the desert and delivered it to the right places, and settled the right debts, and built the right roof, and asked, finally and imperfectly and not without difficulty, for help from people who turned out to be worth asking. She had not done it cleanly. She had not done it without mistakes, without uncertainty, without the particular brand of stubbornness that Clara Finch had gently named several times, and Jonah Bell had been too tactful to name, but had worked around with patient consistency. She had not done it without the specific ache of being someone who had spent 21 years being told, in various ways and by various people, that her body and her circumstances made her a lesser candidate for the life she wanted. She had done it anyway. That was the part she kept coming back to. Not as triumph. Triumph was the wrong word, too large and too clean. More like confirmation, like running a calculation twice and getting the same answer both times. She had suspected for most of her life that she was capable of more than the people around her had accounted for. The desert had confirmed it. The homestead had confirmed it. Denton Vance's letter had confirmed it in a different and more reaching way, the way that being useful to someone you've never met and will possibly never meet confirms something that being useful to yourself alone cannot. A knock at the door. She looked up. The lamp was lower than it had been. She'd been sitting longer than she'd realized. "Come in," she said. It was Jonah Bell, which surprised her. He didn't usually come by in the evenings. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand and the cold coming in behind him, and looked at the letters on the table, and then at her face, and then at the mantel with the bird and the compass. "I saw your lamp was still on," he said. "I was coming back from the Garrity place. Their barn roof needed a quick repair before the cold got worse." He paused. "I thought I'd check you were all right." "I'm all right," she said. "Come in if you want. It's warm." He came in. He closed the door behind him. He sat in the other chair, the one she'd built, at the same time as the table, slightly less even in one leg than the other, a flaw she'd decided to live with rather than rebuild, and looked around her home with the appraising eye that she'd stopped finding unsettling weeks ago. "The floor settled well," he said. "The grain direction correction helped," she said. He looked at the letters on the table between them. Not reading them, they were folded, but acknowledging their presence. It's the way a person does when they notice that something they're sitting next to is significant even without knowing its contents. "Good news," she said, because she wanted to say it to someone, and he was the person who was there, and she'd learned slowly that Jonah Bell could be trusted with things she said without being asked. From Nebraska. The family, the money reached them. "The farm is staying in the family." He looked at her. She had told him enough, over the weeks of working together, that he understood the general shape of it, that she'd sent money to a family she'd never met, that it was connected to the letter she'd brought to the sheriff, that it mattered to her in ways she hadn't fully explained. He hadn't asked for the explanation. He'd worked alongside her and let the shape of the thing become clear in its own time, which was, she thought, the best way to let most things become clear. "Good," he said. It was simple, and he meant it, and it was the right thing to say. They sat in the warm room for a while. The stove clicked with the particular sound of contracting metal. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the wind was doing what the winter wind did across the desert, which was move with indifference and consistency, and the east overhang was doing what it had been built to do, which was redirect that wind away from the base of her east wall. "I've been thinking about the outbuilding," she said after a while. He looked at her. "Already?" "Not for immediate construction. For planning." She looked at the north wall, a structure on the north side of the property. "Small, a proper storage space, maybe room for a mule if I get one eventually. The stone walls of this cabin have a northern exposure that would benefit from a windbreak structure anyway." He was quiet for a moment, turning this over. She could see him, the way she'd learned to see him over weeks of working together, running the practical analysis that he applied to everything structural, assessing the load, the drainage, the exposure, the relationship to the existing building. "You'd need to think about the foundation carefully," he said. "The soil on the north side of this property is different from the south. I noticed it when we were doing the east overhang extension. It's got a clay layer underneath that's going to behave differently under frost." "I know," she said. "That's why I haven't started planning the foundation yet." He almost smiled. "Closer than usual." "What would you need to know about the clay layer?" he said. "Depth. Consistency. Whether it's going to heave under repeated freeze-thaw cycles or whether it's stable enough to work around." She paused. "I'd need someone who knows this land's specific soil composition, ideally. I've been looking at survey records from the county archive, but the detail level isn't sufficient." "Holt has been on this property longer than anyone in Dustwater Springs," Jonah said. "He did metal work for old Hanley 20 years ago, back before the place was abandoned. He'd know the ground." "I'll talk to Holt," she said. He nodded. He was still looking at the north wall, thinking about the outbuilding, and she was content to let him think. This was one of the things she'd come to value specifically about being in his company, the way thinking together didn't require constant verbal confirmation that the thinking was happening. Her father had been the same way. Some people needed noise to prove they were present. Jonah Bell was present without the noise, and so was she, and they'd discovered early that this made them comfortable to work alongside in a way that didn't need to be discussed. "How long were you planning to stay in Dustwater Springs?" he asked. It was a direct question, and it was also not only a direct question, and they both understood that. She looked at the mantle, the bird, the compass. "I didn't plan to stay at all originally," she said. "I came in looking for a bank and a doctor. I had no intention of," she gestured at the room around her, the home, the floor she'd laid, the stove that was warming them both. "And now?" he said. She thought about Denton Vance's letter. She thought about Clara's kitchen table. She thought about a Saturday roof raising and 8 people and a mule and Ruth Garrity, saying good work in the way that meant the highest available thing. She thought about Wade Mercer in his work clothes and Calder Rusk with his patient restraint and Josephine Garrett's comment about the Ridgebeam argument with her sister and Holt banking his fire. She thought about sitting at this table, as in this room with this lamp, writing a letter to a man in Nebraska whose family's land was not ending. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Jonah Bell looked at her with the expression that had, over the course of the past month, stopping short of something and arrived, finally at something she could read clearly. "Good," he said. The same word he'd said about Nebraska. The same simple and entirely meant thing. They sat in the warm room for another hour, talking about the outbuilding foundation and the soil composition problem, and eventually other things, the kind of other things that come naturally when two people have run out of structural problems to solve and find the conversation continuing anyway without structural problems to carry it. She made coffee on the stove. He drank it without complaining about its quality, which was its actual quality frontier. Coffee made by someone who had learned to make it in the desert and had not meaningfully improved since. When he left, she walked him to the door and stood in the doorway and felt the cold of the night on her face while his footsteps went down the path and onto the road toward town. She went back inside. She put the letters away Denton Vance's into her coat, where it would stay until she could add it to the collection alongside her father's compass and Silas Crow's confession. She washed the coffee cups. She banked the stove for the night. She stood at the mantel and looked at the two objects resting on it. The bird on the left, the compass on the right. She picked up the compass. She held it the way she'd held it in the desert, in the dark, waiting out the cold, promising herself she was not going to die in a place where Harlan Pruitt had calculated she'd die. The needle settled to its familiar position without drama or ceremony, as it always had, as it always would pointing north with the same indifferent accuracy that had pointed north since her father had pressed it into her 9-year-old palm. She set it back on the mantel. She put her hand briefly on the carved wooden bird, the smooth wood under her palm. The weight of the thing, light and worn and held by many hands before hers, none of which she would ever know. She left the lamp burning low and went to bed. Outside, the winter wind moved across the New Mexico desert with its indifferent consistency. It moved across the sandstone formations south of the Jornado Range, across a bluff where there was a hollow in a back wall. Where nothing was anymore, she'd left nothing behind. When she'd gone back, taken everything that mattered and put the stone back in place and walked north. It moved across the hardpan where a wagon had kept moving and a young woman had watched it go. It moved across 5 acres of land east of Dustwater Springs, past a homestead with a good roof and an east overhang that directed the drainage exactly where it needed to go. Eliza Wren lay in her bed in her warm house and listened to the wind and felt it find the east overhang and be redirected. And she thought about what her father had said about north. This will always tell you where north is. The rest is just figuring out how to get there. She had figured out how to get there. Not cleanly, not without help, not without the particular cost of having to learn, slowly and imperfectly, that asking for help was not the same as owing something. Not without the cost of 30 miles of desert on a bad ankle, or 3 days on a sandstone floor, or a dead man's conscience, carried across the badlands in a breast pocket. But she had gotten there. The compass still pointed north. She no longer needed to check. She was already home.